One morning, a man wakes from uneasy dreams to discover that during the night while he slept, he has been transformed into a monstrous insect. There is no explanation. There is no cause. There is no moment of transformation shown or described. Consciousness simply arrives to find that everything has already changed. The man is Gregor Samsa, and the story is The Metamorphosis, and this opening is perhaps the most famous sentence in modern literature. But what matters most is not the transformation itself, but the waking, the moment when awareness encounters a condition that has already occurred, irrevocable and complete. This is Franz Kafka's fundamental vision of human existence. We wake into situations we did not choose. We find ourselves accused of crimes we do not know. We seek authorities we cannot reach. We discover that we have become selves we do not recognize. The metamorphosis is always already finished by the time we become conscious of it. There is no before, no explanation, no path back. There is only the condition itself and the question of how to continue. The Kafkaesque is not about bureaucracy, though bureaucracy appears. It is not about absurdity, though the situations are absurd. It is not even primarily about alienation, though alienation saturates every page. The Kafkaesque names something more fundamental, the gap between consciousness and world, between self and meaning, between the life we are living and the life we somehow expected to live. It names the condition of being awake in a reality whose rules are real but illegible, whose authorities are powerful but invisible, whose judgment is certain but whose crime is never specified. Kafka saw this condition with unbearable precision. An insurance lawyer in Prague, writing through the night while his body failed him, he found words for what should be unsayable. His characters wake to arrest without charge, embark on journeys to castles they will never reach, fast before audiences who no longer care, and transform into creatures whose families cannot bear to look at them. And somehow, a century after Kafka's death, these visions still feel like our own condition described exactly. What did Kafka see when he looked at human existence? How did he perceive what others could not? The answer lies not in single metaphors or allegorical equations, but in the accumulation of his life, his work, his letters, his diaries, his unfinished novels, and his dying instruction that all of it be burned. Kafka's vision emerged from the collision of specific circumstances: a father who could not be satisfied, a city divided against itself, a profession he could not escape, a body that betrayed him, and nights of writing that felt like both salvation and doom. His influence extends across literature, philosophy, and the very language we use to describe our experiences. Camus built his philosophy of the absurd on Kafka's foundation. Borges recognized in him a kindred explorer of infinite regressions and impossible architectures. Beckett learned from him how little is needed to convey everything, and the word Kafkaesque entered common speech, though often misused, to name the particular quality of being caught in systems that exist but cannot be navigated, subject to powers that judge but never explain. But before Kafka became an adjective, before his work defined modernism, before Max Brod refused to burn the manuscripts, there was a boy born in Prague in 1883 into circumstances that seemed designed to create exactly the kind of consciousness that could perceive what Kafka would perceive. The transformation begins not with the waking, but with the life that led to it. To understand what Kafka saw, we must begin with where he stood, with the city and the family and the language that shaped him, with the day work that exhausted him and the night work that consumed him, with the relationships that tortured him and the illness that killed him. This exploration traces that life and that vision across 3 hours of careful consideration. We will move through Kafka's world from childhood to death, through his major works from the Judgment to the Castle, through the letters and diaries that are as essential as the fiction, through the themes that organize his vision of existence. We will attempt to see what he saw, to understand why his characters cannot escape their trials, why his seekers never arrive, why transformation happens while we sleep, and guilt accrues without crime. The Kafkaesque is not external to us. It is the condition we wake into every morning. It is consciousness discovering itself already judged, already other, already seeking what it will never reach. Kafka did not invent this condition. He only named it with such precision that we can no longer pretend not to see it. And that precision, that unbearable exactness, is what we will explore in what follows. Franz Kafka was born on July 3, 1883, in Prague, the capital of Bohemia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This location was not incidental to what he would become. Prague existed in multiple realities simultaneously, and Kafka lived in all of them at once without fully belonging to any. The city contained 3 concentric circles of identity and language, each nested inside the other, each creating its own exclusions and inclusions. The outermost and largest circle was Czech, the majority population, the native language, the emerging nationalism that would eventually dissolve the empire itself. Within this Czech majority existed a smaller circle of German speakers, descendants of medieval settlers and administrators culturally oriented toward Vienna and the broader German-speaking world. And within this German minority existed the smallest circle of all, the Jews who spoke German, attended German schools, and identified with German culture, yet were fully accepted by neither Czechs nor Germans. Kafka lived in this innermost circle. His first language was German, and he attended German language schools throughout his education. But he also learned Czech as a child and used it in daily interactions with Czech speakers who surrounded him. His Jewish identity was complicated by his father's assimilation and his own ambivalence toward religious practice. He belonged to German culture, but knew himself foreign to it. He participated in Czech Prague, but was marked as other. He was Jewish, but distant from traditional observance. This triple marginality shaped everything Kafka wrote. His characters exist in worlds where the rules are clear to everyone else, but opaque to them. They speak the language, but miss the crucial meanings. They follow the procedures, but never achieve the results others seem to reach effortlessly. They are simultaneously inside and outside, present and excluded, fluent and incomprehensible. Prague itself, in the decades around 1900, was a city of extraordinary cultural ferment. German language writers and intellectuals gathered in cafes and literary circles. Max Brod, Franz Werfel, Rainer Maria Rilke, who had been born nearby, Gustav Meyrink, and later others would make Prague a centre of German language literature. Yet this German cultural world existed as an island within the rising tide of Czech nationalism. The Jewish population of Prague numbered around 30,000 in Kafka's youth. Most were assimilated to some degree, speaking German, dressing in contemporary fashion, participating in commercial and professional life. Kafka's father, Hermann, exemplified this assimilated generation. He had grown up in a Czech-speaking village in southern Bohemia, learned German for commercial purposes, built his business in Prague, and raised his children with minimal Jewish religious practice. The synagogue was a social obligation, not a spiritual centre. Jewish identity was something inherited, acknowledged, but not actively lived. Yet this assimilation existed in a precarious space. Czech nationalists saw German-speaking Jews as part of the German cultural occupation. German nationalists saw Jews as fundamentally other, regardless of language or culture. Anti-Semitism existed in both communities, sometimes latent, sometimes overt. The sense of not quite belonging, of being tolerated but not welcomed, of speaking the language fluently yet being heard as foreign, permeated the experience of Prague's German-speaking Jews. Kafka would return to this sense of radical homelessness throughout his work. His characters often have German names in Czech settings or ambiguous names that could belong anywhere. They navigate bureaucracies where everyone else seems to understand the unwritten rules. They arrive in villages where they are expected but not welcomed, where promises are made but never kept, where authorities exist but cannot be reached. The geography of Kafka's fiction mirrors the geography of his life. Apparent clarity concealing impenetrable complexity, surface integration concealing profound alienation. The Prague of Kafka's childhood and youth was also a city of physical beauty and historical weight. The Charles Bridge with its Baroque statues, the castle complex dominating the hill above the city, the medieval streets of the Old Town, the Jewish Quarter with its ancient cemetery and synagogues. Kafka walked these streets daily. He knew the city with the intimacy of someone who has never lived anywhere else. Yet his fiction rarely describes this beauty. His Prague is corridors and attics and courtrooms that could be anywhere, spaces defined by function rather than character, places that exist to contain procedures rather than lives. This effacement of the specific in favour of the universal would become characteristic of Kafka's art. He removes the picturesque details that might locate a story in a particular place or time. He strips away the descriptive passages that might make the world feel inhabited and real. What remains is the skeletal structure of situation and relation, the bare architecture of authority and subjection, the geometric clarity of the impossible. But this clarity emerged from specific historical ground. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century was a vast multi-ethnic state, holding together dozens of nationalities and languages through increasingly fragile administrative structures. Kafka's work at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute would give him intimate knowledge of these bureaucratic systems. His fiction would transform this knowledge into visions of courts without location and castles without access. But the transformation began with actual experience of how power operates through procedure, how authority can be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Prague was changing rapidly during Kafka's lifetime. Czech nationalism grew stronger. The empire was weakening. World War I would destroy the old order entirely. By the time Kafka died in 1924, Prague was the capital of the new Czechoslovak Republic, and the German-speaking minority had lost its former position. The world Kafka had known as a child was vanishing. Perhaps this dissolution made it easier for him to see the instability beneath all apparently solid structures, the temporariness of institutions that present themselves as eternal. But before considering what Kafka made of his circumstances, we must understand the most powerful force in his childhood world, his father Hermann, who would cast a shadow across Kafka's entire life and become the antagonist in a letter that was never sent, and a struggle that was never resolved. Hermann Kafka was born in 1852 in Vosek, a Czech-speaking village in southern Bohemia. His childhood was marked by poverty and hard physical labour. His father was a kosher butcher who struggled to support a large family. Hermann received minimal education and worked from a young age. He learned German as a necessity for commerce. He moved to Prague in his early 20s and built a business selling fancy goods through determination, physical strength, and relentless work ethic. By the time his son Franz was born, Hermann had achieved significant success. He owned a shop selling haberdashery and accessories on the Old Town Square. He employed workers. He supported his family comfortably. He had made himself through sheer will from poverty to prosperity, from village to capital, from Czech to German, from nothing to something. This self-creation filled him with justified pride and made him intolerant of weakness, introspection, or impracticality. Hermann Kafka was physically imposing, loud, energetic, certain of his opinions, and accustomed to dominating any room he entered. He expected obedience from his children and could not comprehend why his eldest son, thin and nervous and bookish, could not be more like him. The father was body, the son was consciousness. The father was action, the son was hesitation. The father knew what he wanted, the son questioned everything including his own wants. Franz Kafka lived his entire life under this shadow. He feared his father and craved his approval. He rebelled against him and internalized his judgments. He defined himself in opposition to him, yet measured himself by his standards. The father became the primary relationship of Kafka's existence, the one he could neither accept nor escape, the one he would spend decades trying to explain, justify, and understand in letters, diaries, and fiction. In 1919, at age 36, Kafka wrote a letter to his father that would eventually become known as Letter to His Father. The letter runs 80 pages in printed form. It is an attempt to explain to Hermann why their relationship had become what it was, to lay out the case for the defense, to show how a child experienced what the father believed was simple, firm parenting. The letter was never delivered. Kafka gave it to his mother to pass on to Hermann, but she, understanding that nothing good could come of it, quietly returned it to her son. The letter is one of the essential Kafka texts. It contains his fullest articulation of the father wound, the sense of inadequacy before paternal authority, the impossibility of ever measuring up or ever being free. But the letter is also something more complex than simple accusation. It is simultaneously an indictment of the father and an acknowledgement of the father's perspective. It builds the case against Hermann with prosecutorial thoroughness, then undermines that case by imagining how Hermann would respond, then complicates things further by acknowledging that Kafka himself has become something his father cannot be blamed for creating. The letter describes a childhood dominated by fear. Fear of the father's loud voice, his physical presence, his unpredictable anger, his casual humiliations. Kafka recalls being carried onto a balcony one night as a small child and locked outside in his nightshirt because he had been crying for water. The incident scarred him. For years afterward, he was disturbed by fantasies of his father coming in the night. The fact that Hermann likely forgot the incident immediately made it worse, proof that what was traumatic for the child was trivial for the father. The letter describes how Hermann's standards were impossible to meet and inconsistent in application. The father demanded that the children eat everything on their plates, yet he pushed away food he found unsatisfying. He demanded good manners, yet he picked his teeth and cleaned his ears at the table. He demanded success in business, yet he mocked Franz's interest in writing as useless fantasy. The son could never win because the father changed the rules while insisting they were absolute. But Kafka also writes that he understands his father's position. Hermann had struggled out of poverty through strength and determination. He had every right to be proud. He had worked hard to provide for his family. He wanted his children to appreciate what they had been given. He could not comprehend a son who seemed ungrateful, who preferred books to business, who was weak where the father was strong, who complicated what should be simple. The letter builds to a remarkable acknowledgement. Kafka admits that he has used his father as an excuse for his own failures. He has blamed Hermann for his inability to marry, his lack of professional success, his general inadequacy in life. But this blaming is itself a strategy, a way of avoiding responsibility by locating all causation in the father. The son is both victim of the father and creator of the father as excuse. This move is quintessentially Kafkian. The accusation folds back on itself. The victim reveals himself as complicit. The clarity of cause and effect dissolves into paradox. The father is guilty, but the son is also guilty, and the guilt cannot be cleanly assigned to one side or the other. This is the logic of the trial, where Joseph K. knows himself innocent yet guilty, and of the castle, where K is simultaneously in the right and in the wrong, legitimate and illegitimate, insider and intruder. Hermann Kafka never read the letter. He died in 1931, 7 years after his son, having outlived the child he never understood. The letter entered publication as part of Kafka's literary estate, and readers have argued ever since about whether Kafka's portrait of his father is fair, whether Hermann was truly a tyrant or simply a man of his time and class, whether Kafka's sensitivity was a perceptive gift or a kind of wound that never healed. What cannot be disputed is the centrality of the father figure in Kafka's imaginative world. The father appears everywhere in his fiction, sometimes directly, more often in displaced forms. Authority figures are fathers. Judges are fathers. The castle officials are fathers. The officer in the penal colony who worships the old commandant and dies defending his legacy is a son before a father. Gregor Samsa's transformation destroys his ability to provide for his family and releases his father from apparent infirmity into renewed vigour and violence. The father is the law that cannot be reached, the authority that cannot be satisfied, the power that is both obviously present and fundamentally inaccessible. You can see the father, speak to the father, but you cannot make the father understand. You can obey the father, but the father's demands will shift and your obedience will always be inadequate. You can rebel against the father, but rebellion is still defined by what it opposes, still trapped in the relationship it tries to escape. Hermann Kafka gave his son the paradigm through which he would see all power relations, the asymmetry of authority, the impossibility of appeal, the guilt that precedes any crime, the judgment that is certain though its grounds remain forever unclear. The father made the son who would write the trial, and the son made the father into literature, preserving in writing the relationship that could never be resolved in life. But Hermann was not the only force shaping the young Kafka. There was also Julie, the mother absorbed in the business and emotionally distant, and there were the 3 sisters, and there was the apartment above the shop where privacy was impossible and escape was never complete. Franz Kafka was the eldest child and only son of Hermann and Julie Kafka. He had 3 sisters, Gabriele, known as Ellie, born in 1889, Valerie, called Vali, born in 1890, and Ottilie, called Ottla, born in 1892. 2 brothers, Georg and Heinrich, died in infancy before Franz reached school age. This meant that Franz was both eldest and only son, bearer of his father's expectations and hopes for continuation. The family lived in a series of apartments in the old town area of Prague, always close to Hermann's business, always with the shop's demands shaping the family's rhythms. Hermann and Julie worked long hours. The children were often cared for by servants and governesses. Franz remembered his childhood as lonely despite being surrounded by family, the loneliness of being physically present but emotionally unattended. His mother Julie came from a more educated and established Jewish family than Hermann's. The Lowy family had some wealth and cultural sophistication. Julie's father had been a prosperous textile merchant and brewer. She had received better education than Hermann and could write fluent German. But she deferred to her husband in all things and was absorbed in helping manage the business. Franz experienced her as gentle but absent, sympathetic but unable to protect him from his father's dominance. Of his 3 sisters, Ottla would become the closest to Franz in his adult years. She shared something of his sensitivity and his resistance to convention. She wanted to study agriculture and work on a farm, an aspiration their father found incomprehensible. She eventually managed a farm briefly and later married a Czech Catholic man, a marriage that scandalized the family. Kafka confided in Ottla and trusted her judgment in ways he could not with his other sisters or his parents. She was the one family member who seemed to understand him. All three sisters would die in the Holocaust. Ellie and Vali were sent to the Lodz ghetto in 1941 and later transported to the Chelmno extermination camp, where they were murdered. Ottla was sent to Theresienstadt in 1942 and later volunteered to accompany a children's transport to Auschwitz, where she was killed in October 1943. They appear in Kafka's letters and diaries as presences he cared for but could not protect, family ties that felt like obligations he could not fulfill properly. Kafka's education followed the standard pattern for German-speaking middle-class Jews in Prague. He attended German-language elementary school and then the Altstädter Deutsches Gymnasium, one of the elite German secondary schools in the city. The gymnasium provided rigorous education in classics, literature, science, and languages. Kafka studied Latin and Greek, along with German, learned French, and continued his Czech. He was a capable student but not exceptional, dutiful in his work but not brilliant. The gymnasium years from 1893 to 1901 were marked by the same sense of not quite belonging that characterized his position in Prague more generally. He was German-speaking among Czech speakers, Jewish among Gentiles, sensitive among rougher boys. He made a few close friends but was not socially prominent. He read extensively and began to think of himself as a writer, though he showed his work to almost no one. One friend from these years was Oscar Pollock, a thoughtful young man who shared Kafka's literary interests. They exchanged long letters about books and ideas. Kafka's earliest surviving letters are to Pollock, written with self-conscious elevation and passionate intensity about literature. These letters reveal an adolescent Kafka already articulating what he believed literature should be, something that shocks and disturbs, something that breaks the frozen sea within us, something that is not consolation but challenge. After finishing the gymnasium in 1901, Kafka enrolled at the German University of Prague. He began in chemistry, switched after 2 weeks to law, and settled into the long grind of legal education. He also took courses in art history and German literature. Law did not interest him intellectually, but it offered a respectable profession that might satisfy his father while leaving mental space for what he actually cared about, which was reading and writing. The university years were marked by intensifying literary engagement. Kafka read voraciously. Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Flaubert, Kierkegaard, and many others. He attended lectures, discussions, and literary events. And in October 1902, at a lecture by a visiting writer, he met the person who would become the most important friend of his life, the one who would eventually preserve his literary legacy against his wishes, Max Brod. Kafka's childhood and youth were marked by a deep sense of inadequacy before the world. He felt himself weak where others were strong, uncertain where others were confident, complicated where others were simple. He experienced his sensitivity not as a gift, but as a disability, a failure to be properly thick-skinned and robust. This sense of not measuring up would intensify rather than diminish as he aged. It would shape his relationships, his work life, his attempts at marriage, and above all his writing, where weakness and failure and inadequacy would become not defects to be concealed, but conditions to be examined with unflinching clarity. But he was not entirely alone in this sensitivity. There were friends who understood something of what he felt. And there was the beginning awareness that perhaps the inadequacy he felt before ordinary life might be the precondition for perceiving what others could not see, for articulating what should remain unspoken. The loneliness of childhood was beginning to transform into the solitude necessary for writing, though this transformation would take years to complete and would never fully resolve the suffering that fed it. Max Brod was everything Kafka was not, He was confident, socially skilled, prolific, optimistic, and certain of his literary vocation. He wrote novels, plays, poems, essays, and reviews with astonishing fluency. He made friends easily and maintained them. He believed in progress, in art, in the possibility of happiness. He was also deeply loyal, generous with his time and attention, and possessed of genuine literary talent, even if his reputation would later rest primarily on his relationship with Kafka rather than his own work. Kafka met Brod at a lecture in October 1902, when both were students at the German University of Prague. They were both interested in literature and philosophy. They began walking home together after lectures, talking about books and ideas. The friendship deepened rapidly. Within months they were meeting regularly, sharing work, reading aloud to each other, and beginning what would become a lifelong dialogue about art, life, and everything else. Brod immediately recognized Kafka's extraordinary gifts. He saw that beneath the diffidence and self-doubt was a writer of unique vision and absolute integrity. He encouraged Kafka constantly. He urged him to publish. He arranged publications when Kafka was reluctant. He defended Kafka's work to publishers and critics. He became both advocate and audience, the reader for whom Kafka wrote even when he believed no one else would care. The friendship was asymmetrical but genuine. Kafka admired Brod's energy and confidence. Brod revered Kafka's genius. Kafka relied on Brod's practical help with publishing. Brod depended on Kafka's judgment about literature and truth. They travelled together, especially in the early years. Trips to Riva on Lake Garda, to Weimar, to Paris, to sanatoriums. They knew each other's families. They confided in each other about relationships, work, and creative struggles. Their literary judgments often differed. Brod valued Goethe and believed in cultural idealism. Kafka was drawn to darker writers, Dostoevsky, Flaubert, Kleist. Brod believed literature could and should offer uplift. Kafka believed literature should disturb and wound. Brod wrote about ideas and historical figures. Kafka wrote nightmares that felt more real than reality. But these differences enriched rather than diminished the friendship. Each recognized what the other achieved, even when it was not what he himself would attempt. Brod also introduced Kafka to a wider circle of writers and intellectuals in Prague. Through Brod, Kafka met Felix Welch, Oscar Baum, Franz Werfel, and others who formed the loose constellation of Prague German writers. He attended readings and discussions. He became known, though always as someone who listened more than he spoke, someone whose presence was quiet but whose judgments, when he offered them, carried weight. The friendship became especially crucial when Kafka began to produce the work that mattered. In 1912, after years of false starts and abandoned fragments, Kafka wrote The Judgment in a Single Night. He read it aloud to Brod and to his sisters. Brod immediately understood its importance. He arranged for its publication. He did the same for the Metamorphosis when Kafka completed it a few months later. Without Brod's advocacy, Kafka's early work might have remained in drawers, and the breakthrough might have been stillborn. But Brod's most consequential act would come after Kafka's death. Kafka had given Brod clear instructions in his will, and in a later note, destroy everything unfinished. Burn the manuscripts of the 3 unfinished novels, The Trial, The Castle, and America. Burn the stories Kafka considered inadequate. Burn the diaries and letters. Leave only the small number of works Kafka himself had published. This instruction was absolute and repeated. Max Brod refused. He could not bring himself to destroy what he knew was great literature. He edited and published the novels. He edited and published the stories, the diaries, the letters. He spent decades working on Kafka's literary estate, producing editions, writing Kafka's biography, defending Kafka's reputation, shaping how readers would encounter and interpret the work. Without Brod's betrayal of Kafka's wishes, almost everything we know as Kafka's work would not exist. This refusal remains ethically complicated. Kafka's instructions were clear. He had the right to control what became public after his death. Brod ignored this right. Yet Brod's judgment was correct. The unfinished novels are masterpieces, essential to understanding 20th century literature and thought. The diaries and letters are as important as the fiction. Had Brod obeyed Kafka's wishes, literature would be immeasurably poorer. Kafka must have known or suspected that Brod would not obey. He chose Brod as executor, knowing Brod's character, knowing Brod's belief in his work. Perhaps the instruction to burn was itself paradoxical, a way of both protecting himself from posterity and ensuring that someone who loved him enough to disobey would preserve what he could not quite destroy himself. Or perhaps Kafka genuinely wanted the work destroyed, and Brod simply failed him one final time, though this failure gave the world The Trial and the Castle. The friendship between Kafka and Brod shows us something essential about Kafka's relationship to the world. He needed mediators. He needed people who could translate between his hypersensitivity and the rough surfaces of ordinary life. He needed someone to believe in him when he could not believe in himself. Brod provided this, and the cost of this provision was that Kafka's most private work would become public, that his letters and diaries would be read by strangers, that his instruction to burn would be rendered null. But without Max Brod, there would be no Kafka as we know him. The man who could not navigate ordinary social relations, who could not sustain engagement, who wrote in solitude and doubt, depended on a friend who could navigate for him, who could carry his work into the world he could not face. This dependence was humiliating and necessary, wounding and generative. It was another version of the paradoxes Kafka explored in fiction: the need for what cannot be accepted, the dependence on what cannot be tolerated, the mediation that is both help and obstacle. Through Brod, Kafka would find publishers. Through Brod, he would be introduced to the literary world of Prague and eventually beyond. But before that, there was the necessity of earning a living, the day job that Kafka would maintain for 14 years while writing at night, the work that exhausted him and gave him material, the profession he resented and could not entirely escape. Franz Kafka completed his doctorate in law from the German University of Prague in June 1906. His dissertation examined issues in medieval legal history. The degree qualified him for legal practice or for positions in government or business administration. Kafka had no passion for law. He had chosen it because it was respectable, because it might satisfy his father, and because it seemed to demand less total commitment than medicine or other professions might require. After a mandatory year of unpaid legal work at the criminal and civil courts, Kafka began looking for employment. His first position was with Assicurazioni Generali, an Italian insurance company with offices in Prague. He started in October 1907. The work was exhausting and poorly paid. The hours extended late into the evening. Kafka hated it. He felt the job was destroying any possibility of writing. After 9 months, he was desperate to leave. In July 1908, through family connections, Kafka secured a position at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia, a semi-governmental agency responsible for workers' compensation insurance. This was a significant improvement. The salary was better. More importantly, the workday ended at 2 in the afternoon, leaving the rest of the day theoretically free for writing. Kafka would remain at the Insurance Institute for 14 years, until illness forced his early retirement in 1922. The Institute's work involved assessing workplace injuries, determining compensation, and classifying businesses by risk category to set premium rates. Kafka's role included investigating injury claims, writing reports, and occasionally dealing with appeals. He was competent at this work and received regular promotions, eventually becoming a senior secretary. His colleagues respected him. His superiors valued his thoroughness and clear writing. He handled difficult cases with tact and precision. But Kafka experienced this work as draining and deadening. The afternoon freedom it theoretically provided was undermined by exhaustion. He came home from the office depleted. He ate, rested, sometimes napped, and often could not summon the energy to write until late at night. Then he would write until 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, sleep a few hours, and return to the office. This schedule was unsustainable, but he maintained it for years, destroying his health while producing the work that mattered to him. The insurance work gave Kafka intimate knowledge of bureaucratic systems, industrial processes, and the administration of power through paperwork and procedures. He saw how accidents were categorized and quantified. He saw how human suffering was translated into forms and reports. He saw how rules that seemed clear in the abstract became murky in application. He saw how authority operated through hierarchy and delay, through reference to higher offices and deferred decisions, through procedures that seemed designed to exhaust the will of anyone seeking justice or clarity. This knowledge entered his fiction transformed but recognizable. The court in the trial has no central location and no clear chain of command, but it functions through papers and hearings and referrals to other offices. The castle in the castle is surrounded by subordinate officials and assistants and messengers, but no one can gain access to the true authority. The bureaucracy is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, potent and ineffectual, capable of destroying Joseph K., yet incapable of specifying his crime. Kafka also saw at the Insurance Institute how workers with genuine injuries struggled to navigate the system designed to help them. They faced forms they could not understand, procedures they could not follow, officials who might be sympathetic but who were bound by regulations. The institution existed to serve them but often felt like an obstacle they had to overcome. This contradiction between purpose and effect, between official function and lived experience, would become central to Kafka's vision of how power works. Yet we should not reduce Kafka's fiction to allegory about bureaucracy or about his job. The insurance work provided material and knowledge, but what Kafka made of this material was something stranger and more profound. His bureaucracies are not merely inefficient or frustrating, they are metaphysically impossible. They exist in spaces that cannot exist. They operate by rules that contradict themselves. They are real, but also nightmares, exact and also absurd. The split between day work and night writing defined Kafka's existence for 14 years. During the day, he was Dr. Kafka, competent insurance official, respected colleague, dutiful employee. At night, he was the writer who could not sleep, who covered page after page with cramped handwriting, who struggled to capture visions that dissolved when he tried to articulate them. The two selves seemed incompatible, yet they somehow coexisted, the daylight self funding and draining the night self redeeming and condemning the daylight self. Kafka often wrote in his diary about the impossibility of this split existence. He believed he needed uninterrupted time to write properly. He fantasized about being able to write continuously for weeks or months, about descending into the work so completely that ordinary life would vanish. He blamed the office job for his struggles with writing, yet he also needed the structure the job provided, the external order that his internal chaos could push against. The other difficulty was that Kafka found it almost impossible to write when he was happy or content. He needed tension, suffering, deprivation. The exhaustion and frustration of the office job fed the writing even as it prevented it. The impossible schedule created the pressure that generated the work. Kafka was trapped in a double bind, He could not write properly while working, but he could not generate the material to write properly without the work. This double bind mirrors the situations his characters face. They need to reach the court to defend themselves, but attending the court exhausts them and prevents them from living the life they are trying to defend. They need to enter the castle to begin their work, but the effort to enter prevents them from doing any work at all. They need the thing that is destroying them and are destroyed by their need for it. Kafka remained at the Insurance Institute through World War I, exempted from military service because his work was classified as essential to the war economy. He saw colleagues leave for the front. He processed claims from war-related injuries in munitions factories and other industries. He navigated the bureaucratic chaos of wartime administration. And all the while, he wrote at night, producing stories and fragments, working on the trial, beginning the castle, filling diary after diary with observations and self-reproach. In 1922, his tuberculosis had progressed to the point that he could no longer work. He applied for and received early retirement with a pension. He was 39 years old. He had spent 14 years at the Insurance Institute. He would live 2 more years. The freedom from work that he had craved and believed would unlock his writing came too late, when his body was failing and his time was running out. But before the tuberculosis diagnosis, before retirement, there was the breakthrough that made everything else possible. The night of September 22nd to 23rd, 1912, when Kafka wrote The Judgment in a single sitting and discovered that he could produce something that felt complete and true and entirely his own. For most of his life, Franz Kafka wrote at night. Not in the pleasant evening hours after a reasonable workday, but late in the hours after midnight, when exhaustion battled with the compulsion to write, and the compulsion almost always won. He would come home from the Insurance Institute in mid-afternoon, eat, rest, try to sleep, fail to sleep, and then sit at his desk as the clock moved past 11, past midnight, into the hours when the city was silent and he was alone with the page. This schedule was destructive and necessary. It destroyed his health, contributing to the insomnia that plagued him for years and weakening his body before tuberculosis arrived to finish what exhaustion had begun. Yet Kafka believed he needed this isolation, this severance from ordinary life, this descent into the night where nothing existed except himself and the writing. He wrote about this struggle constantly in his diaries and letters. He reproached himself for not writing. He tracked his attempts and failures with obsessive precision. He described the rare nights when the writing flowed as ecstatic experiences, as moments when he felt truly alive and justified. He described the many nights when nothing came, when he sat at his desk and produced nothing, when the exhaustion and the silence pressed down and no words appeared. Kafka was an extraordinarily slow writer. He revised constantly, crossing out sentences, rewriting paragraphs, abandoning stories when they refused to resolve. He wrote in small, cramped handwriting that filled notebook after notebook. He dated his diary entries precisely and often noted the exact time of writing. He tracked his output with a bookkeeper's attention to detail, as if quantifying the work might make it more real or more valuable. The condition for writing, Kafka believed, was absolute solitude. He needed to be alone not just physically, but psychologically, severed from all claims and connections. He needed to descend into a state where ordinary life vanished and only the work existed. Marriage was impossible because it would end this solitude. Family obligations were obstacles because they pulled him back into the world. Even friendship could be draining if it required social presence rather than just correspondence. This need for solitude was both psychological requirement and practical necessity. Kafka could not work amid distractions. He was hypersensitive to noise. The sound of neighbours talking or walking, the traffic in the streets, even his own family moving through the apartment, disturbed him. He fantasized about living in a cellar with no windows, a place of absolute silence where nothing from outside could intrude. Yet this very isolation fed the writing's particular qualities. Kafka's prose has a dream logic, a sense of being disconnected from normal causality and consequence. His characters exist in worlds where the ordinary rules seem suspended, where courts have no location and castles cannot be reached, where transformations happen overnight and no one questions them. This dreamlike quality emerged from writing produced in the borderland between waking and sleep, in the hours when rational consciousness begins to dissolve. The notebooks Kafka used for his fiction also contain his diaries, letters he drafted but never sent, random observations, records of dreams, and passages of self-examination. Writing was thinking for Kafka. He could not clarify his thoughts without writing them down. He could not examine his life without turning it into text. The boundary between fiction and diary, between story and self-analysis, remained porous. Characters in his stories carry his emotional states. Diary entries read like fragments of stories. Everything was material. Kafka also experienced writing as a kind of wound, a necessary injury. He famously wrote to Oscar Pollock in 1904 that he believed books should be like axes for the frozen sea within us, that literature should shock and disturb rather than console. He applied this standard ruthlessly to his own work. He believed that only writing produced in extremity, in suffering and solitude and exhaustion, had value. Comfortable writing, writing produced in contentment, struck him as worthless. This view led him to destroy or abandon much of what he wrote. He published only a small fraction of his output during his lifetime. He considered most of his stories inadequate. He never finished his 3 major novels. He instructed Max Brod to burn everything unfinished after his death. The work that passed his standard was rare and hard-won. Everything else was failure. Yet what Kafka considered failure often looks like brilliance to readers. His abandoned fragments are as powerful as his finished stories. His diaries are as essential as his fiction. The work he wanted destroyed includes The Trial and the Castle, novels that would define modernist literature. Kafka's judgment of his own work was severe to the point of self-destruction. He demanded perfection and found only inadequacy. The schedule of night writing meant that Kafka existed in a state of permanent sleep deprivation. He functioned on 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night for years. He had terrible insomnia, lying awake even when he tried to rest. He relied on sleeping pills and other medications. He tried various remedies: open windows, breathing exercises, dietary changes. Nothing helped for long. The exhaustion accumulated year after year. This exhaustion shows in his appearance in photographs from his 30s. He looks gaunt and haunted. His eyes are shadowed. His body is thin to the point of fragility. He aged quickly under the strain of the impossible schedule. When Tuberculosis appeared in 1917, it found a body already weakened by years of self-imposed deprivation. Yet Kafka believed this was the only way to write what needed to be written. Ordinary life, with its demands and distractions and compromises, prevented access to the truth he sought. Only in the night, in exhaustion and solitude, could he approach what he needed to say. The cost was his health and ultimately his life. But the alternative in his mind was not writing at all, which would have been no life at all. This belief shaped not just his schedule, but his whole approach to existence. He could not marry because marriage would end the solitude. He could not quit his job because he needed the structure it provided, even as he resented it. He could not compromise with his father because that would require pretending to be someone he was not. He could not simplify his inner life because complexity was his element. He was trapped by his own requirements for writing into a life that made writing barely possible. The paradox reached its fullest form in his fiction, where characters need what is destroying them and are destroyed by their own needs. But before exploring those works fully, we must consider the breakthrough moment, the night in September 1912, when everything changed and Kafka discovered what he could do. The night of September 22nd to 23rd, 1912, was the most important in Franz Kafka's literary life. He sat down to write around 10 in the evening and did not rise until 6 the following morning. In that single 8-hour session, he wrote the complete text of the story, The Judgment, working in a state of focused intensity he would rarely achieve again. When he finished, he knew something fundamental had changed. He had discovered his voice. Kafka recorded the experience in his diary with unusual detail. He noted the physical sensations, the terrible strain, the painful cramping of his legs from sitting, the power and joy of the writing itself. He described how the story unfolded as if receiving dictation, how the middle section emerged in such a rush that he could barely keep up with the words appearing in his mind. He wrote that only in this way could writing happen, with complete opening of body and soul. The story itself is short, only about 10 pages. It begins with a young businessman named Georg Bendermann finishing a letter to a friend in Russia. The friend had emigrated some years ago and had not prospered. Georg hesitates to share good news about his own life for fear of highlighting his friend's failure. But Georg is engaged to be married, happy, successful, and he finally decides to share this news. The story shifts when Georg enters his father's dark room to tell him about the letter. What follows is a confrontation in which the father, who had seemed weak and confused, suddenly grows powerful and begins to attack Georg with accusations. The father claims the Russian friend does not exist, or that he exists but has become the father's ally. The father accuses Georg of trying to supplant him, of betraying the friend, of selfishness and deception. The father grows larger and more menacing until finally he delivers a verdict. Georg must drown himself. Georg accepts the verdict immediately. He rushes from the apartment through the streets to a bridge over the river. He climbs the railing and drops into the water, dying as instructed. The story ends with traffic beginning to cross the bridge, covering his fall. The story makes no realistic sense. The father's accusations are confused and contradictory. The power shift from weak old man to omnipotent judge happens without explanation. Georg's acceptance of the death sentence is psychologically impossible. Yet the story feels absolutely true in its emotional logic. The father's power to judge and destroy is real, even if the specific accusations are incoherent. The son's guilt is real, even if no particular crime can be specified. The sentence is real, even though it is absurd. Kafka recognized immediately that he had achieved something new. The story felt to him complete, inevitable, and unquestionably his own, in a way that his earlier scattered attempts at fiction had not. He dedicated the story to Felice Bauer, a woman he had met just 5 weeks earlier at Max Brod's parents' house. The meeting with Felice and the writing of The Judgment were connected in ways Kafka would spend years trying to understand. The breakthrough was technical as well as emotional. Kafka had found a narrative voice that could present the impossible as fact, that could combine precision of detail with dream logic, that could make the fantastic feel real through sheer accuracy of description. Georg Bendermann's movements are described with clarity. The father's room is physically specific. The bridge where Georg dies is a real bridge in Prague. Yet within this precise realism, impossible events occur and no one questions them. This combination would define Kafka's mature style. His stories refuse allegory. They are not symbols standing for something else. They are themselves. Exact descriptions of impossible situations. A man wakes as a vermin. Another is arrested without charge. A third seeks a castle he cannot reach. These things happen in the world of the story as actual events, not as metaphors. The precision of description makes the impossibility more disturbing rather than less. The judgment also introduced the father-son struggle that would recur throughout Kafka's work. The father is authority, judgment, law, and death. The son is guilty though innocent, condemned though blameless. The father's power is absolute and arbitrary. The son can neither escape nor satisfy it. This dynamic would reappear in the Metamorphosis, in the trial, in the letter to his father, and in countless diary entries where Kafka examined his own failure before the father's standards. After finishing the judgment, Kafka wrote immediately to Felice Bauer to tell her about the story and its dedication to her. He had met Felice only briefly, but that meeting had affected him powerfully. She was 24, worked in an office in Berlin, and seemed to Kafka both attractive and solid, someone who might offer stability and connection. He began to build in his mind the fantasy that she could be his salvation, the person who would make normal life possible. The next month, November 1912, Kafka wrote The Metamorphosis in another sustained burst of work. The breakthrough had opened something. For a brief period, the writing that had been so difficult became almost fluid. He was still working nights, still exhausted, still struggling, but the material was flowing in ways it had not before. He had found access to the vein he needed to mine. But the breakthrough also revealed the cost of writing at this level. Kafka understood that producing work of this intensity required everything he had. It was incompatible with marriage, with family life, with normal happiness. The more clearly he saw what he could achieve as a writer, the more clearly he saw that achieving it would require sacrificing the ordinary life he also desperately wanted. This contradiction would define the next several years. Kafka would pursue engagement to Felice while knowing that marriage was impossible. He would long for connection while needing solitude. He would try to reconcile writing with normal life while understanding that they were fundamentally incompatible. The breakthrough of September 1912 made his genius clear, but also made clear the price that genius would demand. The judgment was published in 1913, The Metamorphosis in 1915. They established Kafka as an important new voice in German literature, though his audience remained small. Critics and fellow writers recognized the originality and power of the work. But Kafka had no illusions about fame or success. He had discovered what he could do. Now he had to live with that discovery and its consequences. Franz Kafka met Felice Bauer on August 13, 1912, at the home of Max Brod's parents. She was visiting Prague on business from Berlin, where she worked as an office manager for a dictation machine company. Kafka noticed her immediately. In his diary that night, he described her almost as if cataloguing an apparition. Empty face, exposed neck, nose almost broken, blonde hair, firm cheeks. He wrote to her for the first time in September. Thus began one of the most extraordinary epistolary relationships in literature. 5 years of correspondence, over 500 letters from Kafka to Felice, 2 engagements, 2 breakings off, and a sustained meditation on the impossibility of marriage conducted through the very medium that made marriage impossible. The letters to Felice are literature. They were not intended as such. Kafka was not performing for posterity. He was trying to court a woman he believed could save him from solitude and make normal life possible. But the sheer volume and intensity of the letters, their mixture of love and self-accusation, their simultaneous pursuit and evasion, their documentation of a soul in permanent crisis, elevate them beyond mere correspondence into essential texts for understanding Kafka. Kafka wrote to Felice almost daily, sometimes multiple times per day. He demanded that she write back just as frequently. He needed her letters as evidence that she still cared, that the connection persisted despite the distance. When she did not write, he fell into despair. When she wrote briefly or merely cordially, he felt abandoned. He needed constant reassurance, yet could not believe the reassurance when it came. The letters reveal Kafka's impossible demands. He wanted Felice to understand him completely, yet feared that understanding would drive her away. He wanted her to accept his need to write, yet could not promise that writing would ever make way for the marriage she expected. He wanted her to be strong and independent, yet also to subordinate her life to his requirements. He wanted her love, but feared he could not return it properly. Kafka also used the letters to explain himself, to lay out his needs and limitations with brutal honesty. He told Felice that he was difficult, nocturnal, asocial, obsessed with writing. He told her that marriage frightened him because it would require regular social life, entertaining, normalcy. He told her that his health was poor, his sleep disturbed, his nerves fragile. He was building a case against himself while also insisting that she accept him. They became engaged in June 1914. Kafka travelled to Berlin to meet Felice's family. The engagement was officially announced, but Kafka immediately fell into panic. The reality of engagement made marriage feel imminent, and marriage meant the end of the isolated writing life. A month later, in July 1914, there was a confrontation in a Berlin hotel, sometimes called the Tribunal, where Felice and her friend Greta Bloch confronted Kafka about his behaviour and his real intentions. The engagement was broken off. World War I began that August. The catastrophe of European civilization commencing was somehow appropriate backdrop to Kafka's personal disasters. He and Felice had no contact for months. Kafka threw himself into work on The Trial, the novel about Joseph K's arrest and trial and execution, the novel that transforms the impossibility of resolution into narrative form. But in 1915, Kafka and Felice began corresponding again. The letters resumed their intensity. They met in Berlin and in Bohemian towns. They spoke of reconciliation. In July 1917, they became engaged for a second time. Kafka travelled to Budapest with Felice to find an apartment where they might live after marrying. And then in August, less than a month after the second engagement, Kafka began coughing blood. The diagnosis was tuberculosis. The disease gave Kafka the excuse he needed. The engagement was broken off again, this time for good. Tuberculosis in 1917 was often fatal. There was no cure, only rest and hope that the body's defences would contain the infection. Kafka knew this. He also knew, though he might not have admitted it directly, that the illness was a kind of salvation. It made marriage impossible without requiring him to reject Felice himself. His body had said no, when his will could not. Kafka's relationship with Felice shows his fundamental dilemma. He longed for connection, for normal life, for the warmth and stability of marriage and family. But he also needed absolute solitude for writing, and he believed that writing was his only justification for existing. These needs were incompatible. He could not have both. And faced with the choice, he chose writing, though the cost was loneliness and the knowledge that he had hurt someone who had offered him love. The letters to Felice were published decades after both their deaths. They reveal Kafka's self-lacerating honesty, his inability to deceive either himself or others about his limitations, his painful awareness of what he was demanding and what he could not give. They also reveal Felice as patient, affectionate, and eventually exhausted by Kafka's contradictions. She married someone else in 1919 and had a more ordinary, presumably happier life. But for Kafka, the relationship with Felice was formative in ways that extended beyond personal happiness. It taught him the shape of his own impossibility. It showed him that he could not sustain ordinary intimacy while maintaining the inner conditions necessary for writing. It forced him to choose, and the choice was both obvious and terrible, Writing won because writing was what he was, even if being a writer meant being alone. This choice resonates through his fiction. His characters are often bachelors, isolated men pursuing impossible goals. When they have families, as Gregor Samsa does, the family becomes burden and accusation rather than comfort. When they pursue women, as Joseph K. does briefly, the pursuit goes nowhere. The emotional impossibility of Kafka's life with Felice became the structural impossibility of his fiction, where connection cannot be sustained and solitude cannot be escaped. The Metamorphosis had been written in the first flush of his relationship with Felice, before the complications fully emerged. It is the story to which we now turn, the most famous thing Kafka wrote, the transformation that has become iconic and which must be understood carefully if we are to see what Kafka actually achieved rather than what interpreters have made of it. The Metamorphosis begins with the sentence that has become one of the most famous openings in all literature. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. The German word is Ungeziefer, which means vermin or pest, something to be eliminated, something disgusting. It does not specify which creature exactly. Translators have chosen giant insect, monstrous bug, cockroach, beetle, but Kafka deliberately left it vague. What matters is not the zoological category, but the fact of being vermin, of having become something revolting. The transformation has already occurred when the story begins. There is no explanation. There is no cause. There is no why. Gregor does not remember transforming. He simply wakes and it is done. The fact is presented with absolute matter-of-factness. Gregor notices his brown arching belly divided into stiff sections. He sees his many legs waving helplessly. The description is precise and physical. This is not a dream. This is what has happened. Gregor's first reaction is not horror at being an insect, but worry about being late for work. He is a travelling salesman, the sole support of his family since his father's business failed 5 years ago. He must catch his train. He must make his appointments. He must not lose his job. The immediate practical concerns overwhelm the ontological crisis. This is quintessentially Kafkan. The impossible is absorbed immediately into the texture of obligation and routine. Gregor's family lives in a cramped apartment. His parents and younger sister Greta occupy the other rooms. They depend entirely on his income. He has been working to pay off his parents' debts to his employer, nearly finishing this obligation. He had hoped that once the debts were paid, he might live differently. But now he is vermin, and everything has collapsed. The family's response to Gregor's transformation develops across the story. Initially, there is shock and confusion. The manager from Gregor's company comes to investigate why he has not appeared for work. Gregor tries to speak, but his voice has become unintelligible squeaking. He tries to open the door with his jaws since his legs do not work properly. The manager flees in horror. Gregor's father drives him back into his room with a stick. For a time, the family tries to accommodate Gregor. His sister Greta brings him food and cleans his room. She discovers he likes rotting vegetables and old food rather than the fresh milk he used to prefer. She removes the furniture so he can crawl on the walls and ceiling. She becomes his caretaker, the only one who will enter his room without terror. But accommodation erodes into resentment and burden. Gregor's inability to work means the family must support itself. The father finds employment again. They take in lodgers to make rent. Greta gets a sales job. The family dynamic inverts. The father regains vitality and authority, while Gregor becomes more insect and less human. His consciousness remains human in certain ways, yet adapts to vermin existence. He enjoys crawling on walls, but remains attached to memories of his family and his former life. The crisis comes when Greta is playing violin for the lodgers, and Gregor, drawn by the music, emerges from his room. The lodgers see him and are disgusted. They announce they will vacate immediately without paying. Greta, exhausted and despairing, declares that they must get rid of the thing. She refuses to call it Gregor anymore. If it were really Gregor, it would have left on its own rather than force the family to live with an insect. The father agrees. Gregor must go. Gregor retreats to his room for the last time. He thinks of his family with love and tenderness. The word love is used. He felt great love for them. The clock strikes 3 a.m. and Gregor dies, his consciousness fading into nothing. The cleaning woman discovers the body the next morning. She disposes of it, though Kafka does not specify how. The family takes a day trip into the countryside. They discuss their prospects, which now seem brighter. They notice that Greta has become a beautiful young woman despite the strain. They begin planning to find her a husband. The story ends with springtime and hope and the family's future, Gregor utterly forgotten. The Metamorphosis has generated countless interpretations. It has been read as allegory for alienated labour, for the Jewish experience, for disability, for family dysfunction, for mental illness, for Kafka's relationship with his father, for the human condition itself. All of these readings find support in the text. None of them exhaust it. What matters most is how Kafka presents the transformation. He refuses to explain it. He refuses to allegorize it. He simply shows it happening and follows the consequences with remorseless logic. This is what makes the story both realistic and fantastic, both specific and universal. The transformation is literal within the story's world, but it resonates with every experience of becoming what others cannot accept, of discovering that the self one presents to the world is no longer bearable. Gregor's consciousness is the heart of the story. He remains aware throughout. He remembers his human life. He feels love for his family. He understands what is happening to him. He does not become fully insect, only insect-bodied with consciousness that remains partly human. This split is the true horror, not being transformed, but being transformed while still being yourself, trapped in a condition you cannot change or escape while remaining aware of what you have lost. The family's response is equally important. They do not reject Gregor immediately. They try to cope. But the burden becomes too great. The disgust becomes insurmountable. The practical necessities overwhelm love and duty. Kafka shows without judgment how love fails under strain, how even Greta, who cares for Gregor most devotedly, eventually cannot bear it anymore. The family is not vilified. They are simply human, and their humanity has limits. The story's horror lies in its precision. Kafka describes Gregor's body with entomological accuracy. He tracks the family's responses with psychological realism. He builds the apartment's geography so we know exactly where each person is at each moment. This precision makes the impossible transformation feel inevitable rather than arbitrary. If a man did wake as Vermin, Kafka shows us, this is exactly how it would unfold. The comedy must not be missed. Kafka laughed while reading the story aloud. There is something darkly funny about Gregor's attempts to communicate while squeaking, about his concern for work when he is an insect, about the manager's horror, about the lodger's affronted dignity. The story is tragic but also absurd. The two qualities do not contradict but intensify each other. The Metamorphosis was published in 1915 during World War I. Kafka insisted that the insect not be illustrated on the cover. He wanted no definite image to replace the reader's imagination. The story became Kafka's most famous work during his lifetime and has remained so. It defined for many readers what Kafkaesque means: ordinary life invaded by the impossible, the fantastic presented as fact, transformation without explanation or appeal. But Kafka had already begun work on something even more ambitious and more troubling, the novel that would occupy him through 1914 and 1915, and that would remain unfinished at his death. The Trial, the book in which the arrest comes before any crime and the verdict comes before any understanding. Joseph K. is arrested on the morning of his 30th birthday. He has done nothing wrong. He does not know why he is arrested. The men who arrest him cannot or will not tell him. They eat his breakfast and examine his papers, but provide no information. They tell him he is arrested, but that he may continue his normal life. There is no jail, no restraint, only the fact of arrest and the summons to appear for interrogation. This is how the trial begins. The novel would occupy Kafka through 1914 and 1915, written mostly during the period of his first engagement and breakup with Felice Bauer. He never finished it. The manuscript consisted of completed chapters and fragments. Max Brod assembled these into a novel after Kafka's death, making editorial decisions about order and inclusion that scholars continue to debate. The novel follows Joseph K. through his attempt to understand and fight the court that has arrested him. He is a bank official, competent and respected, 30 years old, living in a boarding house, conducting an affair with a woman named Elsa. His life is ordinary and successful until the arrest makes everything else impossible to sustain. The court is everywhere and nowhere. Joseph K. receives summons to appear for interrogation in a tenement building, in an attic room reached through a labyrinth of corridors. The room is full of people, though whether they are there for interrogations or for other reasons is unclear. A magistrate conducts the proceedings, but the proceedings themselves have no clear structure. Joseph K. tries to make a speech defending himself, but he does not know what he is defending himself against. He learns that the court has branches everywhere, in attics and basements, in ordinary buildings disguised as residences. He learns that lawyers defend accused men, though the lawyers seem to achieve nothing. He learns that judges can be influenced, though the mechanisms of influence are obscure. He learns that cases drag on for years, that accused men become obsessed with their trials, that the trial consumes everything until nothing else remains. Joseph K. hires a lawyer, a sick old man named Huld, who lies in bed receiving clients and mistresses and meals. The lawyer explains that he knows court officials and can file petitions, but he also admits that these petitions rarely accomplish anything. The defense strategy seems to consist mainly of delay and supplication, filing endless documents that may never be read, courting officials who may have no power. Joseph K. meets other accused men. There is Block, a merchant who has been entangled in his case for 5 years, who has hired multiple lawyers and abandoned his business to focus entirely on the trial. Block has become servile and pathetic, grovelling before the lawyer for scraps of information. Joseph K. is horrified and fascinated, seeing in Block his own possible future. There is also the painter Titorelli, who paints portraits of judges and claims to have influence with the court. He explains to Joseph K. the 3 possible outcomes for a case. Definite acquittal is theoretically possible, but has never actually occurred. Ostensible acquittal means being released temporarily, though arrest can happen again at any time. Indefinite postponement means keeping the case at the lowest level forever, never advancing to final judgment. These are the only options, and the best one can hope for is postponement. The logic is maddening. Joseph K. cannot defend himself because he does not know the charge. He cannot approach the court directly because there is no direct approach. He cannot use normal procedures because the procedures do not work. Every attempt to engage with the court deepens his entanglement. The more he tries to resolve the case, the more impossible resolution becomes. The novel includes a parable told by a prison chaplain to Joseph K. late in the book. This parable, called Before the Law, is one of Kafka's most famous passages. A man from the country seeks admittance to the law. A doorkeeper stands before the door and tells him he cannot enter now, but perhaps later. The man waits. Days, years, decades pass. The man grows old waiting. Finally, dying, he asks why no one else has ever sought admittance to the law through this door. The doorkeeper answers that this door was meant only for him, and now it will be closed. The chaplain and Joseph K. discuss the parable's meaning. Is the doorkeeper deceiving the man? Is the man deceived by himself? Is the law accessible or not? They reach no conclusion. The parable, like the trial itself, permits multiple interpretations that cannot be reconciled. Access is simultaneously possible and impossible. The man is both prevented from entering and responsible for not entering. The law exists but remains forever inaccessible. The novel ends with Joseph K.'s execution. On the evening before his 31st birthday, exactly 1 year after his arrest, 2 men come for him. They walk him to a quarry outside the city. They lay him on a stone and prepare to kill him with a knife. Joseph K. realizes he is supposed to take the knife and kill himself, sparing his executioners the effort. But he cannot. He dies like a dog, aware that the shame will outlive him. The trial is Kafka's most direct engagement with guilt and law and judgment. Joseph K. insists on his innocence, yet somehow accepts his guilt. He claims he has done nothing wrong, yet acts as if conviction is inevitable. The court never specifies his crime, yet treats him as obviously guilty. The verdict is certain before any evidence is heard. Execution comes without trial in any normal sense. This is guilt without crime, law without justice, authority without legitimacy. Yet the court is real. It has power over Joseph K.'s life and death. It can arrest him and execute him. The fact that it operates without explanation or justification does not make it any less powerful. Kafka shows us that authority does not require rationality to function, that power can be arbitrary and still be absolute. The novel is also about obsession. Joseph K. becomes consumed by his trial. His work suffers. His relationships dissolve. He thinks about nothing else. The trial, which has no substance, takes over his entire existence. The accusation, though empty of content, determines everything. This is the real punishment, not whatever judgment might eventually come, but the waiting and uncertainty and consuming preoccupation that destroy life before any sentence is passed. The trial remained unfinished. Kafka left chapters in various states of completion and left no clear indication of how the novel should be ordered. Max Brod made decisions that shaped how generations of readers encountered the book. Later scholarly editions have presented the text differently, showing the fragments and uncertainties. But regardless of the precise order, the novel's vision is clear. We are all on trial. None of us knows the charge, and the court cannot be reached, though its judgment is certain. Joseph K.'s situation is Kafka's situation universalized. The son before the father's inexplicable judgment becomes every man before authority's inexplicable judgment. The specific wound becomes the general condition. And what Kafka discovered in examining his own impossibility was something permanent about how power works and how consciousness experiences that power. But the trial, though Kafka's most famous novel, was not his last attempt to map impossible territory. In 1922, weakened by tuberculosis, Kafka began another novel that would remain unfinished, The Castle, in which arrival replaces trial and inaccessibility replaces judgment, but the fundamental situation remains the same. Before moving to The Castle, we must pause to consider what Kafka achieved in the trial regarding guilt, because this is one of his most profound contributions to understanding human existence. Joseph K. has committed no crime, yet he is guilty. This is not psychological guilt, the feeling of having transgressed. This is something more fundamental. Ontological guilt, guilt as a condition of being rather than a consequence of doing. Joseph K. insists throughout the novel that he has done nothing wrong. He is correct. the court never specifies any crime. No evidence is presented against him. No witnesses testify. Yet everyone treats him as guilty. The guards who arrest him, the magistrate who interrogates him, the lawyer who defends him, even Joseph K. himself eventually. The guilt is simply there, prior to any action, independent of any transgression. This vision of guilt without crime has roots in religious thought, particularly in Christian conceptions of original sin and in certain strands of Jewish understanding of human inadequacy before divine law. But Kafka secularizes this insight, removing it from theological context while retaining its psychological and existential force. We do not need to believe in sin or God to recognize the experience of being guilty without knowing why, of being judged by standards we cannot discern, of failing tests we did not know we were taking. The court in the trial operates as a kind of secular theodicy, a mechanism for distributing judgment without requiring justification. It exists. It has power. It renders verdicts, but it provides no access to the principles governing its decisions. This is authority in pure form, divorced from reason or legitimacy, yet fully operational. And crucially, this authority does not need to justify itself. It simply is. Kafka understood something that political and legal theory often obscures. Most authority operates this way most of the time. We are subject to powers we cannot fully understand, operating by rules we did not agree to, rendering judgments we cannot appeal. The specifics change across cultures and historical periods, but the structure remains constant. The trial makes this structure visible by stripping away the justifications and procedures that normally conceal it. Joseph K.'s guilt is also guilt for existing as he does. He is a bank official, competent and successful by conventional standards. Yet the trial reveals that this competence is superficial, that beneath the surface of normal life lies inadequacy and failure. K cannot navigate the court because the court requires something he does not have and cannot acquire. His very way of being is insufficient. This connects to Kafka's sense of his own guilt before his father. Hermann Kafka represented a standard Franz could not meet: physical strength, practical competence, certainty, success in the world. Franz's sensitivity and introspection and dedication to writing were not alternative goods, but simply failures to be what the father required. The guilt was not for specific actions, but for being the wrong kind of person. The trial universalizes this familial situation. All of us are guilty of being who we are rather than who we should be. The standards are real though unknown. The judgment is certain though its basis remains obscure. We are all Joseph K., arrested on a morning that seemed ordinary, discovering that we have failed in ways we cannot specify or correct. This is why the trial feels claustrophobic despite including scenes in multiple locations. The court is everywhere because guilt is everywhere. There is no outside, no place of innocence from which to judge the court or to mount a defense. Joseph K. is always already implicated. His attempts to defend himself only deepen his guilt by revealing his misunderstanding of his situation. The court also has no centre. There are low-level officials and high-level officials, but reaching the high-level officials is impossible. There are petitions and procedures, but they lead nowhere. There are judges, but the judges answer to other judges who answer to others in infinite regression. Authority is distributed across an endless hierarchy where no one has final power and everyone claims to be following orders from above. This vision of bureaucracy as metaphysical condition rather than merely social organization is one of Kafka's most lasting insights. Modern readers encounter the trial and recognize their own experiences with institutions that seem designed to frustrate rather than serve, with systems where everyone is following procedures but no one takes responsibility, with structures that have no accessible point of appeal or correction. But Kafka is not simply criticizing bureaucracy. He is revealing something about the nature of law itself. Law claims to be rational, knowable, applicable through clear procedures. But law as experienced is often incomprehensible, its procedures opaque, its application seemingly arbitrary. The gap between law as ideal and law as experienced is the space where the trial occurs. The philosopher Theodor Adorno wrote that Kafka's work shows us that there is no position outside the spell from which the spell can be suspended. Joseph K. cannot stand outside the court to judge its legitimacy because the court constitutes the reality within which judgment occurs. This is the deepest horror, not that the court is unjust, but that justice and injustice are categories the court defines, and we have no access to any standard beyond what the court provides. Yet this totalizing vision does not lead Kafka to despair exactly, or at least not only to despair. There is something like dark comedy in Joseph K.'s situation, in the gap between his expectations of how courts should work and how this court actually works, in his persistent belief that explaining himself properly will change anything. The novel invites laughter as well as horror, recognition as well as alienation. The guilt without crime that Joseph K. experiences connects to another major theme in Kafka's work: the inaccessible, the authority or goal or truth that exists but cannot be reached. This theme receives its fullest treatment in The Castle, where the protagonist seeks entry and employment and recognition but finds only endless deferral and obstruction. Kay arrives in the village late at night. He has been hired as a land surveyor by the castle authorities who govern the village and the surrounding region. He carries a letter confirming his appointment, but from the moment he arrives, everything becomes complicated. He is both expected and unexpected, legitimate and illegitimate, employed and rejected, inside and outside all at once. This is how The Castle begins. Kafka wrote the novel in 1922 during his final stay in a sanatorium before his tuberculosis became terminal. Like the trial, it remained unfinished. Unlike the trial, where the end is clear even if some middle chapters are fragmentary, The Castle simply stops mid-sentence. Kafka never determined how or whether Kay's quest would resolve. The castle sits on a hill above the village. It looks unimpressive, a rambling structure that could be a town rather than a single building, but it exercises absolute authority over the village and its inhabitants. The castle officials determine everything: employment, marriage, residence, business. Nothing happens without the castle's approval. Yet reaching the castle proves impossible. Kay expects to present himself, to begin his surveying work, to establish his life in the village. Instead, he encounters endless obstacles. The officials he needs to see are always unavailable. The castle is always visible, but the paths to it lead nowhere. Messages from the castle arrive but contradict each other. Kay is told he is needed and that he is not needed, that his appointment is valid and that no appointment exists, that he should wait and that he should act. 2 assistants are assigned to Kay, supposedly sent from the castle to help with his work. They are identical, childish, more hindrance than help. They follow Kay everywhere, preventing any privacy or solitude. They seem to have no actual function beyond observation and interference. Kay tries to dismiss them but cannot. Kay takes lodging at an inn. The innkeeper and her husband have complicated relationships with the castle. They revere castle officials and fear castle judgment. The innkeeper's husband once received a letter from a castle official 20 years ago and still treasures it, though the letter has no current relevance. This past contact with castle authority defines his identity. Clam is the castle official with whom Kay needs to speak. Clam supposedly handles the land surveying department, but Clam is never available. He stays at the inn sometimes, in a room K can see but not enter. K attempts to waylay Clam in corridors or to get messages to him, but every attempt fails. Clam receives thousands of petitions and reads none. He is present yet absolutely inaccessible. K becomes involved with Frida, a barmaid at the inn who is or was Clam's mistress. Through Frida, K hopes to reach Clam. They become lovers and plan to marry. But the relationship is shaped entirely by K's quest. He wants Frida because she might provide access. She wants K, but also wants to return to Clam. Everything is instrumental, strategic, subordinated to the goal of reaching the castle. The village itself operates according to rules K does not understand. Villagers are respectful but unhelpful. They speak of the castle with reverence and fear. They explain that reaching castle officials is impossible for outsiders, that K's attempts are futile and possibly dangerous, that he should accept the situation and settle into whatever life the castle permits. But K cannot accept this. He continues trying to reach Clam, to get his appointment clarified, to begin his actual work. Letters arrive from the castle. One confirms K's appointment and praises his work, though he has done no work. Another criticizes his behavior and threatens dismissal. The letters seem to describe a different reality than the one K experiences. The castle's perception of what is happening bears no relation to what is actually happening, yet the castle's perception is the only one that matters. K meets various villagers who have had encounters with castle officials or who know something about how the castle operates. There is Barnabas, a young man who claims to work as messenger between the village and the castle. Through Barnabas, K sends petitions and receives occasional responses. But Barnabas himself is uncertain whether he is actually a castle messenger or whether the officials he delivers messages to have any real authority. Barnabas's family has been ruined by a past offence against a castle official. His father insulted an official years ago, and since then the family has been ostracised. They have spent years trying to regain the castle's favour, but the castle ignores them. The father has died waiting. Barnabas and his sister Olga continue hoping that somehow the family's position can be restored. But the offence seems permanent, the judgment irreversible. K's quest consumes everything. He neglects Frida. He loses his lodging at the inn and has to move into a school building where Frida has found work. He stops thinking about land surveying and thinks only about reaching Clam, about understanding the castle's system, about getting his position clarified. The goal becomes the entire content of his life, and the goal remains perpetually out of reach. The castle is about seeking what cannot be found, about the quest that defines existence but cannot be fulfilled. K is not guilty like Joseph K in the trial. He has committed no crime and faces no trial. Instead, he is seeking employment, recognition, a place in the community. These are reasonable desires, but the castle withholds what K seeks, not through active denial, but through inaccessibility, through the impossibility of ever reaching the authority that could grant what he wants. The novel is also about mediation. Between K and his goal stand endless intermediaries: assistants, messengers, innkeepers, village officials, clerks. Each claims to have some connection to real authority. Each offers to help or to explain. But the help and explanations lead nowhere. The intermediaries multiply without bringing K any closer to Clam or the castle. The system is all mediation without any direct access to the source of authority. The castle is often read as religious allegory, K seeking God, the castle representing divine authority, Clam as Christ, or as the infinite distance between human and divine. Kafka's interest in Judaism, his late life study of Hebrew, his notebooks filled with reflections on religious questions support this reading. Yet the novel resists simple allegorization. It is too physically specific, too concerned with actual labour and lodging and bureaucratic procedure to be only about theological concerns. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that Kafka found in religious questions the structure of a more general human predicament. We seek justification, meaning, recognition from something beyond ourselves. We hope that if we can just reach the right authority or follow the right procedures, we will receive what we need. But the authority remains inaccessible, the procedures lead nowhere, and the recognition never comes. This is both religious crisis and existential crisis, both specific historical situation and permanent human condition. The castle remained unfinished not because Kafka died before completing it, but because the quest it describes cannot be completed. K will never reach the castle. This is not a failing of the novel, but its central insight. The seeking is the substance. The goal exists as goal, not as achievable destination. And K's determination to keep seeking, even as every attempt fails, is both heroic and futile, admirable and absurd. The novel breaks off mid-sentence. Max Brod reported that Kafka told him how the novel would end. K would receive word on his deathbed that while he had no legal claim to residence in the village, he would be permitted to live and work there on account of certain auxiliary circumstances. Even at the end, authority would grant nothing definitively, would couch permission in qualifications, would provide just enough to keep K tied to the system that has consumed his life. The trial and the castle together form Kafka's most comprehensive vision of the impossible structures that govern existence. The trial we cannot defend, the castle we cannot reach, the guilt we cannot specify, the authority we cannot access. These are not metaphors for something else. They are the thing itself, seen clearly. Franz Kafka's work is haunted by a quality that recurs across different stories and forms. The inaccessible. There is always something that exists, that is real and powerful, but that cannot be reached. This inaccessibility is not accidental or temporary. It is structural, built into the nature of things. And yet characters continue seeking, continue trying to reach what they somehow know cannot be reached. In the trial, the court is inaccessible. Joseph K. attends interrogations but never speaks to anyone with real authority. He hires a lawyer, but the lawyer has no power. He meets a painter who knows judges, but the judges the painter knows are minor figures. The High Court, the authority that could actually resolve his case, remains forever beyond reach. Yet this inaccessible court issues judgments that are absolutely binding. In the castle, the authority is visible but unreachable. K can see the castle from the village. He knows officials are there, but he cannot get to them. Every path leads to dead ends or circles back. Every intermediary claims to have access but produces nothing. Clam is in the inn, in a room K can almost touch, but the distance between them might as well be infinite. In Before the Law, the parable from the trial, the law is guarded by a doorkeeper who says, "Not yet." The man from the country waits his entire life. The door was meant only for him, but he never enters. The law exists. The door exists. Access is theoretically possible, yet the man never gets through, never reaches what he came seeking. In the Penal Colony, a story from 1919, there is a torture machine that inscribes sentences on condemned prisoners' bodies. The machine represents the old commandant's law, a system that is perfect and self-justifying, but the old commandant is dead. His replacement does not support the system. The machine is breaking down. The officer who believes in it tries to save it by subjecting himself to its judgment, but the machine destroys him without revelation. The law that promised understanding through suffering cannot be accessed even through willing self-sacrifice. This pattern of inaccessibility extends to family relations in Kafka's work. Gregor Samsa's family is physically present, but emotionally unreachable. He can see them, hear them, but cannot communicate. The metamorphosis creates a gap that cannot be bridged. His consciousness remains partly human, but his form prevents any real contact. He is present and absent simultaneously. The letter to Hermann Kafka is another document of inaccessibility. Franz writes 80 pages trying to explain himself to his father, trying to make Hermann understand. But the letter is never delivered. Even if it had been delivered, would Hermann have understood? The father and son inhabit different realities. The distance between them cannot be crossed by explanation or by will. This theme of the inaccessible connects to Kafka's Jewish identity in ways that are complex and debatable. In Jewish tradition, God is beyond human comprehension. The law exists, but its fullness cannot be grasped by finite minds. Study and commentary continue endlessly because the text is inexhaustible. The mystical traditions speak of the infinite distance between the human and the divine, a distance that can be contemplated but not abolished. Kafka was not religiously observant for most of his life. His father's Judaism was social and conventional rather than spiritual. Franz attended synagogue as a child but found it meaningless. Yet in his later years he became increasingly interested in Jewish questions. He took Hebrew lessons. He read Jewish texts and histories. He considered emigrating to Palestine. And he engaged in his writing with questions that have theological dimensions even when treated in secular form. The parable before the law can be read as engagement with the Jewish concept of Torah. The law exists. It is meant for you specifically. But approaching it requires passing through mediations and obstacles. Some traditions say the written Torah can be studied, but the oral Torah, the fullness of interpretation and application, is endless. Access is always partial. Understanding is always incomplete. This is not a defect, but the nature of divine law in relation to human capacity. Kafka secularizes these structures but retains their force. His characters seek authorities that exist but cannot be fully known. They are subject to laws that are real but not fully comprehensible. They are judged by standards they cannot discern. They pursue goals they cannot reach. This is existence understood as permanent inadequacy before something greater that remains obscure. The philosopher Walter Benjamin wrote extensively about Kafka and identified this quality of inaccessibility as central to his vision. Benjamin saw Kafka as writing about the weight of tradition without revelation, about law that has lost its content but retained its force. The castle exists but provides no guidance. The court judges but explains nothing. Authority is real but offers no assistance to those subject to it. This vision is bleak but not quite nihilistic. The authorities Kafka describes are not simply illusory. They have real power. They shape lives. They issue judgments that matter. The problem is not that they do not exist, but that they cannot be reached or understood. This is a different predicament than meaninglessness. It is meaning that exists but remains inaccessible. Authority that is real but not available for appeal. Kafka's characters mostly accept that the authority exists. Joseph K. does not deny the court's reality. K. does not deny the castle's power. They argue about the terms of their relationship to authority, not about whether authority is real. They want to be recognized, to have their cases adjudicated, to receive what they believe they are owed. They want access, not abolition. This distinguishes Kafka from many 20th century writers concerned with alienation and absurdity. Camus' characters confront a universe without inherent meaning and must create meaning through revolt. Beckett's characters inhabit a wasteland where nothing means anything and survival itself is questionable. But Kafka's characters face a world that is too full of meaning, not too empty. Everything means something, but the meanings are illegible. The problem is not absence, but inaccessibility. Modern readers often recognize this structure in their own experiences with institutions. We know authorities exist who determine our fates: admissions officers, hiring managers, insurance adjusters, government agencies, courts, banks, hospitals. We can contact these institutions but rarely reach the person who actually decides. We file forms that may or may not be read. We follow procedures that seem designed to exhaust us. We receive decisions without explanation. We cannot appeal effectively because we cannot reach the level where appeals are heard. This is the Kafkaesque situation, not chaos or meaninglessness, but systems that exist and function according to rules we cannot discern. The authorities are real. The judgments matter. But we cannot get to the place where our case could actually be heard. We are subject to power that will not or cannot explain itself. And perhaps this is as close as we can come to explaining why Kafka's work remains so relevant. He found the precise form for a situation that is permanent, the gap between existence and meaning, between self and system, between what we need and what is available. The forms change, but the structure persists. The castle may look different in different eras, but it remains on the hill, visible and unreachable. Before moving to Kafka's later years, we should consider one more aspect of his vision: the body, and how it fails and suffers and inscribes what consciousness cannot speak. Franz Kafka's relationship with his body was marked by discomfort, shame, and eventual betrayal. He was thin and physically weak, never matching his father's robustness. He had chronic digestive problems, insomnia, headaches, and nervous ailments throughout his life. His body seemed to him inadequate and rebellious, refusing to be what he needed it to be. And finally, tuberculosis destroyed him from within, consuming his lungs and larynx until he could neither breathe nor eat properly. This fraught relationship with embodiment appears throughout Kafka's work. His characters have bodies that fail them, or betray them, or transform against their will. Gregor Samsa wakes in a body that is no longer his. The hunger artist in the story of that name fasts until he dies, unable to eat because he never found food that tasted good to him. The prisoner in the penal colony has his sentence inscribed in his flesh by a torture machine. Joseph K. is executed by having a knife thrust into his heart and turned there. K., in the castle, exhausts himself physically in his quest, and finally dies without reaching his goal. The body in Kafka's work is where consciousness encounters its limits. You cannot think your way out of being an insect. You cannot argue yourself out of starvation. You cannot reason away tuberculosis. The body imposes facts that the mind must accept. And this imposition is often experienced as punishment or judgment, as if the body's failure were proof of some deeper inadequacy. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor's transformation is entirely physical. His mind remains partly human, but his body is insect. The split is unbearable. He cannot communicate because his voice is squeaking. He cannot interact with his family because his appearance is disgusting. His consciousness is trapped in a form that makes consciousness irrelevant. The body has become prison and identity both. But the transformation also liberates something. Gregor discovers he can crawl on walls and ceilings. He enjoys hanging from the ceiling in his room. He prefers rotten food to fresh. His insect body has its own pleasures and capabilities, yet these pleasures are incompatible with human life. The family cannot accept an insect member, even if that insect is Gregor. The body has become unbridgeable difference. The death at the end of the Metamorphosis is physical failure. Gregor's wound from the apple his father threw festers. He stops eating. His body simply gives up. The last lines describe his body being swept away by the cleaning woman like trash. The human has become refuse, matter to be disposed of. This is what bodies finally are when stripped of their animating consciousness, objects that decay and must be removed. A Hunger Artist, written in 1922, when Kafka's own body was failing, is about a performer whose art consists of public fasting. In earlier times he had been popular. Audiences came to watch him not eat. He sat in a cage for 40 days at a time, growing thinner and weaker, displaying his suffering as spectacle. But fashion has changed. No one cares about fasting anymore. The Hunger Artist is hired by a circus and forgotten in a corner. He continues fasting not for 40 days, but for weeks and months, far past any record, but no one notices or cares. Finally, someone discovers him near death in his cage. They ask why he has fasted so long, expecting to hear about dedication to art or some grand principle. His answer is simple. He fasted because he never found food he liked. If he had found the right food, he would have eaten like anyone else. His art was not choice but necessity, not discipline but incapacity. The body that could not find nourishment is not transcendent but simply broken. The Hunger Artist dies and is swept away. A panther is placed in his cage. The panther is magnificent, powerful, beautiful, full of life. It eats voraciously. The audience that ignored the dying Hunger Artist crowds around to watch the panther. Life and appetite triumph where asceticism and art failed. The body that works properly, that takes and uses and enjoys, is what people want to see. The body that refuses, that cannot find nourishment, is discarded and forgotten. In the penal colony is Kafka's most direct engagement with the body as site of punishment and meaning. The story takes place in a prison colony where a condemned man is about to be executed by a torture machine. The machine has 12 hours to inscribe the sentence on the prisoner's body using needles and spikes. The inscription goes deeper and deeper until finally the prisoner dies from the wounds. The machine was designed by the old commandant, a visionary who believed that justice should be written on the body. The condemned man would not know his sentence initially. He would learn it by reading it as it was inscribed in his flesh. After about 6 hours, the officer explains, understanding would dawn. The man would decipher his wound. He would know his crime and his punishment simultaneously. Knowledge and suffering would become identical. But the old commandant is dead. The new commandant does not believe in the machine. The visitor observing the execution is skeptical. The machine is breaking down, the procedure no longer supported by the colony's authorities. The officer, who has devoted his life to the machine, decides to save it by subjecting himself to its judgment. He sets the machine to inscribe "Be just" on his own body. The machine malfunctions. Instead of inscribing carefully, it stabs wildly, killing the officer immediately without any dawning understanding. The promise that suffering would bring knowledge fails. The body is destroyed but reveals nothing. The law that claimed to write itself in flesh cannot be read even when accepted voluntarily. These stories show Kafka's understanding of the body as the place where authority ultimately exerts itself. You can argue with verdicts, you can file petitions, you can refuse to accept guilt, but the execution happens in the body. The knife enters flesh. The hunger kills through physical deprivation. The transformation turns you into something your own body cannot sustain. Power, when it needs to be absolute, operates on the body directly. Kafka's own tuberculosis gave him intimate experience of bodily failure. The disease appeared in August 1917 when he coughed blood. The diagnosis was both catastrophic and in some twisted way liberating. It made marriage to Felice impossible, taking that decision out of his hands. It gave him medical justification for retiring from work. It made his fragility official, converting his lifelong sense of physical inadequacy into recognized illness. but it also began the long process of dying. Tuberculosis in the early 20th century had no cure. Patients went to sanatoria for rest and fresh air, hoping their bodies would contain the infection. Sometimes this worked, at least temporarily. Often it did not. Kafka would spend much of his final 7 years moving between sanatoria, each stay bringing temporary improvement followed by relapse and further decline. The disease affected his lungs first, making breathing difficult. Later it spread to his larynx, making speaking and swallowing painful. In his final months he could barely eat and could speak only in whispers. His body was starving and suffocating simultaneously. The writer who had imagined the hunger artist unable to find food he liked found himself unable to eat at all. The writer who had described Gregor Samsa's squeaking voice found his own voice reduced to barely audible whispers. There is terrible irony in Kafka's death. A writer whose work consisted of words died unable to speak properly. A writer whose characters suffered bodily transformation and punishment died from his body's cellular betrayal. A writer who imagined seeking impossible authorities died in a sanatorium, subject to medical authority that could observe but not cure, that could measure but not save. Yet Kafka's experience of his failing body also deepened his work. The later stories, particularly A Hunger Artist and Josephine the Singer, show acceptance of physical limitation that the earlier work did not quite reach. The body fails. This is not punishment for anything. It is simply what bodies do. They are mortal and vulnerable, and finally insufficient to sustain the consciousness they house. The body in Kafka's work thus occupies a paradoxical position. It is what we are and what traps us. It is the site where authority acts, and where we experience suffering we cannot escape. It is matter that resists meaning, yet that is constantly being inscribed with meaning. It fails us and defines us. We are not our bodies, but we cannot be anything else. And when the body stops working, we stop, regardless of what consciousness might still have to say. Kafka's vision of embodiment anticipates much 20th century thought about the body as constructed site, as place where power inscribes itself, as fact that cannot be transcended. But for Kafka, this was not theory. It was lived experience ending in physical collapse and death, and it shaped his fiction into examination of what it means to be consciousness trapped in mortal flesh, subject to transformation and suffering that meaning cannot master or redeem. Before considering the tuberculosis years fully, we should examine the document Kafka wrote in 1919 that brings together family, body, guilt, and impossible explanation, the letter to Hermann that was never sent. In November 1919, Franz Kafka wrote a letter to his father Hermann. The letter would eventually run to over 40,000 words in the original German, 80 pages in printed form. It is at once an indictment, a justification, an explanation, an accusation, and an acknowledgement of complicity. It is one of the most thorough examinations of the father-son relationship ever written, and it was never delivered. Kafka gave the letter to his mother Julie to pass on to Hermann. She read it and understood that giving it to her husband would accomplish nothing good. She quietly returned it to Franz. Years after both Franz and Hermann were dead, the letter was published as part of Kafka's literary estate. It has been read ever since as both personal document and universal exploration of filial guilt and paternal authority. The letter begins with acknowledgement of why writing it is necessary. Kafka notes that face-to-face conversation with his father has always been impossible. Hermann dominates any conversation. He does not listen. He interrupts. He dismisses. The son can never finish a thought or make a case. Writing is the only way Kafka can present his perspective fully. He then begins the central accusation. His father has asked him why he claims to be afraid of Hermann. Kafka's answer fills the letter. He is afraid because Hermann was overwhelming in his physical presence, his certainty, his dismissiveness of anything that did not match his own values and capacities. The child experienced the father as an absolute authority whose judgments were arbitrary but final, whose standards were impossible to meet, whose love was conditional on becoming something Franz could not become. Kafka catalogues specific incidents: the balcony punishment for crying at night, Hermann's table manners that violated the manners he demanded of his children, his mockery of Franz's appearance and abilities, his dismissal of Franz's friends as strange or inadequate, his contempt for Franz's interest in literature and writing. Each incident is described with precision and examined for its effect on the developing child. But the letter is more sophisticated than simple accusation. Kafka repeatedly pauses to acknowledge his father's perspective. Hermann worked hard. He built a business from nothing. He provided for his family. He wanted his children to appreciate what they had and to be strong enough to sustain what he had built. His anger at Franz's weakness and impracticality was understandable from his viewpoint. The letter also acknowledges that Franz has used his father as excuse for his own failures. He has blamed Hermann for his inability to marry, for his professional inadequacy, for his unhappiness. But this blaming is itself a strategy, a way of avoiding responsibility for his own choices and personality. The father is both cause of the son's problems and the son's excuse for those problems. This double acknowledgement complicates the letter's accusation. Kafka shows how he and Hermann were caught in a dynamic neither fully controlled. The father's strength overwhelmed the son's sensitivity. The son's sensitivity interpreted the father's actions as more hostile than they may have been intended. Each amplified the other's worst qualities. The wound was real, but both participated in its creation and perpetuation. The letter addresses specific areas where father and son clashed. Business. Hermann expected Franz to take over, or at least respect the world of commerce. Franz found business meaningless and dedicated himself to literature instead. Marriage. Hermann wanted Franz to marry and have children. Franz entered engagements he could not sustain and blamed his inability to marry on his upbringing. Judaism. Hermann practiced Judaism as social convention without spiritual content. Franz found this empty, but was drawn to more serious Jewish questions his father had abandoned. On marriage specifically, Kafka writes with excruciating honesty about how his father's marriage became the model that made Franz's own marriage impossible. He saw his mother subordinate herself completely to his father. He saw marriage as domination of wife by husband, as loss of autonomy and self. He knew he could not dominate anyone that way, and feared being in a marriage where domination was expected. This knowledge, combined with his need for solitude for writing, made marriage impossible, despite his longing for connection. The letter builds toward a remarkable imagined response. Kafka tries to articulate how Hermann would reply if given the chance. The father would say, "You blame me for everything, but I only wanted what was best for you. You were weak and strange, and I tried to make you stronger. You refused every attempt to help. You retreated into books and fantasies instead of facing reality. You have become nothing because you would not accept guidance. The fault is yours, not mine." Kafka presents this imagined response fairly. It has force. It contains truth. The father is not simply villain. He is a man dealing with a son he cannot understand, trying methods that worked for him, frustrated by their failure. The letter does not refute this imagined response so much as show that both perspectives are simultaneously true and irreconcilable. The letter ends without resolution. Kafka notes that writing it has clarified some things for himself, but probably would not clarify anything for Hermann. The gap between father and son cannot be bridged by explanation. Understanding is impossible, not because either party is bad, but because they inhabit different realities, speak different languages, measure by different standards. Modern readers of the letter often debate whether Kafka is fair to Hermann. Was Hermann really as overwhelming as described? Were his parenting methods normal for his time and culture? Did Franz's hypersensitivity create wounds where none were intended? We cannot know. We have only Franz's account, filtered through his exceptional capacity for self-examination and self-accusation both. What matters is not whether the portrait is objectively accurate, but what it reveals about how Kafka experienced paternal authority. For him, the father was absolute power that could not be satisfied, judgment that could not be appealed, law that could not be understood or obeyed successfully. This experience shaped everything he wrote. The court in the trial is the father. The castle is the father. The officer's devotion to the old commandant in the penal colony is filial. The father in the judgment delivers a death sentence his son immediately accepts. The letter was never delivered, but in a sense it was published for the entire world to read. Hermann Kafka never knew what his son thought of him, but readers ever since have known. The document meant for one person became a text for everyone, the specific wound made universal. This transformation from private to public, from intended audience to actual audience, mirrors Kafka's entire posthumous fate. The work he wanted destroyed was preserved. The letters and diaries he wrote for himself and for specific correspondence were published. The privacy he craved in life was abolished in death. Max Brod's decision to publish the letter to Hermann is part of the larger ethical complexity surrounding Kafka's literary estate. Kafka wanted his unfinished work destroyed. Surely he would not have wanted this letter, never sent, published for public consumption. Yet without it, we would understand Kafka less completely. The father wound would be visible in the fiction, but less fully articulated. The pattern of guilt and judgment and impossible authority would be present but less clearly traced to its source. Hermann Kafka died in 1931, 7 years after Franz. He lived to see some of his son's work published and recognized. Whether he read it, whether he understood what Franz had achieved, whether he felt any pride or regret, we do not know. The father and son never resolved their conflict in life. The son's death ended the relationship without closure. The father outlived the son he had never understood, carrying whatever guilt or incomprehension or grief he felt to his own grave. But the letter remains, 80 pages mapping the terrain of filial inadequacy and paternal authority, explaining everything and resolving nothing, documenting a wound that was specific to one family, yet recognizable to everyone who has ever felt judged and found wanting by the first authorities we encounter in life. After writing the letter in 1919, Kafka had less than 5 years to live. The tuberculosis was worsening. The body that had never been strong was weakening further. The final years would be marked by sanatoria, by brief hopes and longer despairs, by new relationships and deepening illness, by continued writing and the knowledge that time was running out. The diagnosis came in August 1917. Franz Kafka coughed blood one night in his apartment. He consulted a doctor. The verdict was pulmonary tuberculosis. At age 34, he had contracted the disease that would define his remaining years and eventually kill him. Tuberculosis in the early 20th century was common, serious, and often fatal. It was caused by bacteria that infected the lungs, causing coughing, fever, weight loss, and progressive respiratory failure. There was no cure. Treatment consisted of rest, good nutrition, fresh air, and hope that the body's immune system would contain the infection. Many patients improved temporarily, only to relapse later. Some recovered completely, many died. The diagnosis was catastrophic and for Kafka, strangely liberating. It made his physical fragility official. It provided medical justification for breaking off his second engagement to Felice Bauer. It explained the exhaustion and weakness he had felt for years. It gave him reason to reduce his work hours and eventually to retire entirely. The illness made visible and legitimate what had previously been invisible and suspect, his inability to meet normal demands. Kafka spent much of his remaining 7 years in Sanatoria. These were institutions dedicated to treating tuberculosis patients, usually located in mountains or countryside, where the air was clean and the environment peaceful. Patients rested on verandas, ate carefully prepared meals, were weighed and monitored, and waited to see if their bodies would heal. He went first to Zurau, a village in northwestern Bohemia, where his sister Ottla managed a farm. He stayed there for 8 months, from September 1917 to April 1918, living simply and working very little. The rest helped. He felt better physically and mentally. He wrote in his notebooks, though he produced little finished fiction. The pressure of the office job was gone, and without that pressure, he found it difficult to generate the tension necessary for writing. He returned to Prague and resumed work at the Insurance Institute, but at reduced hours. The disease seemed contained. But in 1920 he had a severe relapse and went to a sanatorium in the Tatra Mountains of Slovakia, then to another in southern Bohemia, then back to Prague, then to another sanatorium. The pattern repeated across 1920 and 1921. Temporary improvement, return to normal life, relapse, return to sanatorium. The sanatoria were their own worlds. Patients formed communities. They discussed their symptoms, their treatments, their hopes and fears. They formed friendships and sometimes romantic relationships, knowing that any connection might be cut short by death. They were suspended from normal life, unable to work or maintain regular social ties, focused entirely on their bodies and whether those bodies would betray them today or tomorrow or next month. Kafka wrote to friends and family about sanatorium life. He described the routines, the other patients, the doctors, the landscape. He was sometimes hopeful about improvement. More often he was skeptical that the treatments were helping. He knew that his case was progressing, that each relapse meant further lung damage, that time was working against him. The Insurance Institute granted him extended medical leaves. Eventually, in 1922, he retired with a pension. He was 39 years old and free at last from the day job he had resented for 14 years. But the freedom came when his body was failing, and his energy for writing was diminished. The solitude he had craved was his, but it was the solitude of illness rather than creative retreat. During these sanatorium years, Kafka continued writing, though less prolifically than in earlier periods. He worked on The Castle in 1922. He wrote the final stories that would be collected in A Hunger Artist and published shortly after his death. He filled notebooks with reflections, aphorisms, fragments. The writing changed in tone, becoming less frantic and more resigned, less about struggle and more about acceptance. The tuberculosis also shaped his social life. He could not maintain the energetic friendships and literary connections of his healthier years. He corresponded, but could not travel easily or receive visitors for long. He was increasingly isolated, dependent on medical staff and fellow patients for company. The solitude he had sought became enforced by circumstance. Yet during this period, Kafka formed 2 significant relationships with women. The first was with Milena Jasenska, a Czech translator who began corresponding with him in 1920. Their relationship, conducted primarily through letters, became one of the most intense and revealing of Kafka's life. The second was with Dora Diamant, a young Jewish woman he met in 1923, with whom he would spend his final year in something like happiness before his death. But before considering those relationships, We should note what tuberculosis meant symbolically and medically in Kafka's era. The disease was associated with artists, intellectuals, and sensitive souls. It was romanticized in literature as the illness of the refined and creative. Patients were thought to experience heightened perception and spiritual insight as their bodies failed. This romanticization was mostly nonsense, but it affected how tuberculosis was understood culturally. Kafka did not romanticize his illness. He experienced it as betrayal and failure. His body, always inadequate, now actively destroyed itself. The disease was not tragic beauty, but progressive suffocation. Yet he also wrote about hunger and bodily failure during this period with particular insight, as if the experience of his own dying gave him access to something he could not have reached otherwise. The sanatoria were liminal spaces, neither quite medical institutions nor quite homes, places where people waited to learn if they would live or die. Kafka lived in this liminal state for years. The spaces of his late fiction reflect this quality. The castle village where K waits perpetually for admission, the burrow in the late story where the unnamed narrator tries to construct perfect security against incomprehensible threats, the hunger artist's cage where fasting continues long past any purpose or audience. Tuberculosis made Kafka's body into the site of a slow trial, a progressive judgment that took years to render its final verdict. He could not escape it or negotiate with it or file petitions against it. He could only wait and watch as his lungs failed and his strength drained and his remaining time diminished. The disease was authority that could not be reached, but that determined everything. It was guilt written in flesh, sentence inscribed in the body itself, law that operated with absolute certainty and zero explanation. By late 1922, Kafka understood that recovery was unlikely. He had seen too many relapses. He knew the pattern. But he was not yet dying. He had perhaps 2 years remaining, and in those 2 years he would find briefly a kind of contentment that had eluded him most of his life, first through his correspondence with Milena, and then through his final relationship with Dora. Milena Jasenska was born in Prague in 1896, 13 years younger than Kafka. She was Czech rather than German-speaking, though she knew German well. She had married young to a German writer named Ernst Pollock and moved with him to Vienna. The marriage was troubled. Pollock was unfaithful. Milena was dependent and unhappy. She supported herself partly through literary translation, turning German works into Czech. In April 1920, Milena wrote to Kafka asking permission to translate some of his stories into Czech. He agreed. They began corresponding. Within weeks, the correspondence had become intense and personal, moving far beyond professional matters into confession, passion, and the kind of total psychological exposure that Kafka had previously attempted only with Felice Bauer. The letters from Kafka to Milena, published after his death, are among the most revealing documents he left. They show him more emotionally open, more capable of tenderness and joy, more willing to trust than the earlier correspondence with Felice had been. Milena was intelligent, perceptive, passionate, and understood Kafka with remarkable clarity from the start. She saw his genius but also his damage, his gifts but also his impossibility. They met in person only a few times. In June 1920, Kafka travelled to Vienna for 4 days. They spent time together, and these days seem to have been genuinely happy for both. Kafka wrote later that those days were among the best of his life. They met again in Prague briefly in August 1920. But mostly the relationship existed through letters, dozens of letters, in which Kafka tried to make Milena understand who he was and what he could and could not offer. The relationship was impossible from the start. Milena was married, unhappily but still legally. Kafka was ill with tuberculosis. He lived mostly in sanatoria. He had no money beyond his small pension. His body was failing. He could not offer marriage or stability or a shared life in any conventional sense. Yet he loved her, or loved as much as he could love, and she seems to have loved him in return. The impossibility did not prevent the intensity. Kafka wrote to Milena about his fears, his illness, his need for solitude, his inability to sustain normal intimacy. He explained himself more directly to her than he had to Felice, perhaps because he knew from the start that nothing permanent could come of the relationship. The stakes were lower because the goal was already impossible, and this impossibility paradoxically allowed more honesty. Milena understood Kafka's writing better than almost anyone during his lifetime. She saw immediately what he was achieving. She recognized the precision and the strangeness, the humor and the horror. She translated the Stoker and the Metamorphosis into Czech. She wrote about him in reviews and articles. She was advocate and interpreter, the reader Kafka had always needed. But understanding his work did not solve his life. By 1921, the correspondence was winding down. Kafka's illness was worsening. Milena was trying to extricate herself from her marriage and rebuild her life. The practical impossibilities of their situation could not be overcome by passion or understanding. They remained in contact, but the intensity diminished. The relationship ended not with dramatic break, but with gradual acknowledgement that it could not continue. Milena went on to a significant life after Kafka. She left Pollock and returned to Prague. She became a journalist and writer, contributing to Czech newspapers and magazines. She remarried. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, she helped refugees and resistance members, work that eventually led to her arrest. She was sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she died in 1944 at age 47. Fellow prisoners remembered her courage and generosity even in the camp. She saved some lives before losing her own. Kafka's letters to Milena are extraordinary documents. They are love letters, but also letters of self-examination and impossible explanation. He tries to make her see him fully, including all the ways he is inadequate for love. He writes about his body, his fears, his writing, his past relationships, his family. He holds nothing back, yet the honesty itself creates distance because it reveals how damaged he is. One letter includes a remarkable passage where Kafka imagines Milena standing in a garden among others, and he is somewhere else, looking on. The image captures the perpetual distance he felt from ordinary life and from connection. He can see love. He can recognize it, but he is always outside, observing from a position he cannot leave. The letters also contain some of Kafka's most direct statements about his work. He tells Milena that he writes because he is nothing and that writing is his only mode of existence. He describes writing as both salvation and curse. He explains that he cannot give up writing to live normally because without writing he would not exist at all, yet writing prevents him from living normally. The double bind is absolute and clearly stated. Milena seems to have offered Kafka genuine understanding in ways that Felice, despite her patience and loyalty, could not quite manage. Milena was intellectually and emotionally equipped to comprehend what Kafka was attempting in his work and what he was suffering in his life. She could follow him into the darkness without being destroyed by it. She was strong enough to love him without requiring him to be other than he was. Yet even this understanding could not produce a viable life together. The obstacles were too great. Geography, marriage, illness, poverty, and Kafka's fundamental inability to sustain intimacy without destroying the inner conditions necessary for writing. The relationship gave both of them something important, but could not become what conventional love becomes. It remained beautiful and impossible, which is perhaps why it appears in Kafka's letters as something he treasured precisely because it could not last. After Milena, there would be one more relationship, the final one with Dora Diamant, the woman with whom Kafka would spend his last year and who would be with him when he died. But before considering that relationship, we should note what the Milena correspondence reveals about Kafka's emotional development. He was capable of love. He was capable of joy. He was not only the figure of self-lacerating negation that some readers imagine. He could laugh and be tender and hope for happiness. The impossibility of achieving that happiness was not proof that he did not want it or could not feel it. It was proof only of the contradiction he could never resolve between what he needed to live and what he needed to write. In July 1923, while staying at a Baltic Sea resort, Franz Kafka met Dora Diamant, a 19-year-old Jewish woman from an Orthodox family in Poland. She was working at the resort's children's camp. She was vivacious, intelligent, and serious about her Jewish identity in ways that attracted Kafka immediately. They fell in love. Dora represented something new for Kafka. Unlike Felice or Milena, she was not part of the Prague German literary world. She came from traditional Eastern European Judaism, the world of Yiddish and Hebrew, and religious observance that Kafka had encountered through the Yiddish theatre troupe years before. She studied Hebrew and wanted to live in Palestine. She embodied a Judaism that was living practice rather than assimilated convention. Kafka decided to leave Prague and move with Dora to Berlin. This was an extraordinary decision for someone who had lived his entire life in Prague and who was seriously ill with tuberculosis. But he was determined. In September 1923, they moved to Berlin together. They took a small apartment. They lived as if married, though they were not legally married. For the first time in his life, Kafka lived with a woman he loved in something approaching ordinary domestic life. The Berlin year was difficult, but also happy in ways Kafka had rarely experienced. He and Dora took Hebrew lessons together. They attended Talmud lectures. They walked in the city despite his weakness. They lived simply on his small pension. Kafka read aloud to Dora from his work. She encouraged him and believed in him. She provided the companionship he had always wanted but had never managed to sustain. But the context was terrible. Germany in 1923 was in hyperinflation. Money became worthless. Food was scarce and expensive. The winter was cold and heating fuel was hard to obtain. Kafka, already thin from tuberculosis, began to starve. The disease was advancing. His lungs were failing. By spring 1924, it had spread to his larynx, making eating and speaking painful. Dora tried to care for him but lacked resources. Kafka's family in Prague, hearing how ill he was, insisted he return or go to a sanatorium for treatment. In March 1924, he entered a clinic near Vienna. Dora came with him. The doctors tried various treatments, but the laryngeal tuberculosis was advanced. Eating caused such pain that Kafka could barely consume anything. He was starving to death while doctors watched helplessly. In April, he was moved to a sanatorium at Kierling near Vienna, a place that specialized in throat conditions. Dora stayed nearby, visiting daily. The doctors could do little. Kafka's throat was so damaged that swallowing was agony. He could speak only in whispers. His body was consuming itself. He weighed perhaps 80 pounds. Max Brod visited in the final weeks. He was shocked by Kafka's appearance. They discussed Kafka's work. Kafka was still correcting proofs for the story collection that would be published as a hunger artist. Even dying, he attended to the precision of his prose. He made corrections and comments in writing since speaking was too difficult. Kafka's last weeks were suffering without relief. He wanted alcohol to dull the pain, but doctors would not provide it in quantities that would help. He was given morphine eventually, but it was not enough. He was starving, unable to eat or drink adequately. His body was shutting down. Death was both approaching and not arriving fast enough. He died on June 3, 1924, in the early morning. Dora was with him. He was 40 years old. The cause of death was tuberculosis of the larynx, though by that point multiple systems were failing. His body was returned to Prague and buried in the new Jewish cemetery in a family plot. His parents attended the funeral. Max Brod gave a eulogy. The literary world noticed his passing, but did not yet understand what had been lost. Dora Diamant survived Kafka by 38 years. She kept his memory alive among those who knew her. She told stories about him to friends and later to biographers. She emigrated to England eventually and lived in London. She married and had a daughter. She died in 1952, the last person who had shared daily life with Kafka, who had known him not as the author, but as the man she loved. The final year with Dora represents Kafka's attempt to have something like a normal life. He wanted to escape Prague and his family. He wanted to live with a woman he loved. He wanted to study Hebrew and connect with living Jewish tradition. These desires were reasonable and modest, but his body gave him less than a year before the final collapse. The happiness came too late and lasted too briefly. Yet the happiness was real. People who knew Kafka during the Berlin months said he seemed lighter, more at ease, less burdened by the impossible demands he had placed on himself for so long. Dora gave him acceptance and companionship without requiring him to be other than he was. She understood his work and respected his need to write. She provided the daily warmth and normalcy that his obsessive self-analysis had prevented him from sustaining with Felice or Milena. But even Dora could not save him from his body's failure. The tuberculosis was too advanced. The damage was irreversible. He died before he could marry her, before they could move to Palestine as they had discussed, before he could finish the castle or write the other works he still imagined. Death came in the middle of things, as it does, and left everything unfinished. Before he died, Kafka had given Max Brod instructions about his literary estate. These instructions would shape Kafka's posthumous fate and would create an ethical controversy that continues today. We must now consider what Kafka asked and what Brod did instead. Franz Kafka's will was clear. Written in 1921 and confirmed in a later note, the instructions to Max Brod were explicit. Dearest Max, my last request. Everything I leave behind me, in the way of diaries, manuscripts, letters my own and others, sketches and so on, to be burned unread. The note continued with specificity about what should be destroyed. The unfinished novels, stories Kafka considered inadequate, letters, notebooks, everything except the few works Kafka himself had published. Kafka knew Brod would be executor. He chose Brod precisely because they were close friends, because Brod understood the work's importance, because Brod knew enough to make decisions about the estate. But he also gave Brod instructions Kafka must have known, or at least suspected Brod would not follow. The instruction to burn was both clear and somehow provisional, absolute in its wording, yet given to the person least likely to obey. Max Brod refused. After Kafka's death, Brod examined the manuscripts and letters and diaries. He concluded that destroying them would be a crime against literature. Kafka had created works of genius. Those works belonged to the world, not just to their author. Brod's duty to literature outweighed his duty to follow his friend's explicit instructions. Brod spent decades editing and publishing Kafka's posthumous work. He assembled the trial from Kafka's manuscript chapters, making editorial decisions about order and inclusion. He did the same for the castle and for America. He edited the diaries, removing some material he considered too private, but publishing most. He edited and published the letters to Felice, and later the letters to Milena when those became available. He wrote Kafka's biography. He shaped how readers would encounter and understand Kafka for generations. Without Brod's disobedience, we would have only the small number of stories and one short novel that Kafka published during his lifetime. We would not have The Trial or The Castle. We would not have most of the stories that are now considered Kafka's best work. We would not have the diaries and letters that are essential for understanding both the man and his fiction. Kafka would be a minor German writer of strange short stories, not a defining figure of modern literature. This raises profound ethical questions. An artist has the right to control what becomes public after death. Kafka exercised that right by leaving clear instructions. Brod violated those instructions deliberately. He acted as if he knew better than Kafka what should happen to the work. He privileged the world's interest in the work over the author's wishes regarding it. Yet Brod's judgment was correct. The works he preserved are masterpieces. They have influenced countless writers, filmmakers, philosophers, and artists. They have given language a word, Kafkaesque, for a particular quality of experience. They have provided insight into authority, guilt, law, alienation, and the human condition that no other body of work quite matches. The world is better for having these works available. Some argue that Kafka knew Brod would not obey. The instruction to burn was Kafka's way of protecting himself from responsibility for publication while ensuring that publication would happen. He could tell himself and could tell Felice and others that he wanted the work destroyed, thus avoiding the presumption and exposure of seeking publication. But he left the work in the hands of someone certain to preserve it, thus ensuring the work would survive. Others argue that this psychological interpretation is too clever and that we should take Kafka at his word. He wanted the work destroyed. His reasons were his own. Perhaps he was ashamed of what the diaries revealed. Perhaps he believed the novels were too flawed to publish unfinished. Perhaps he wanted to control his image and his legacy by limiting what survived. Whatever his reasons, his wishes were clear and Brod ignored them. The debate continues in part because the stakes are so high. If we conclude that Brod was right to disobey, we imply that artistic genius gives the world claims on an artist's work that override the artist's own wishes. We say that certain works are too important to respect authorial control, but this path leads to troubling places. Who decides which works are important enough to override an author's wishes? What other instructions might we feel entitled to ignore if we deem the results valuable enough? If we conclude that Brod was wrong to disobey, we face the counterfactual loss of the trial and the castle and everything else Brod preserved. We would have to say that respecting Kafka's wishes matters more than preserving masterpieces of world literature. Most people cannot quite bring themselves to this conclusion, even if they believe authors' rights should be respected. Perhaps the only honest response is to acknowledge the irresolvable tension. Brod acted wrongly in violating his friend's explicit instructions. The works he preserved are invaluable, and their loss would have been tragic. Both statements are true. The ethical dilemma has no clean solution. We benefit from Brod's betrayal while understanding that it was betrayal. Kafka's instruction to burn connects to themes throughout his work. His characters seek authorities who could resolve their situations but cannot reach them. Kafka left instructions that could have resolved the fate of his manuscripts but left them with someone who would not follow them. His characters face laws they cannot understand or obey. Kafka left a will that seemed clear but was ambiguous enough that Brod could justify disobedience. His characters are caught in double binds where any action is wrong. Brod faced a choice where both obedience and disobedience involved profound wrong. The manuscripts themselves had complicated journeys after Brod preserved them. Brod took them with him when he fled Prague ahead of the Nazi invasion in 1939. He settled in Tel Aviv and continued working on Kafka's estate there. After Brod's death in 1968, the manuscripts passed to his secretary and then to her daughters. A decades-long legal battle ensued over whether the manuscripts belonged to Brod's heirs or to the German Literature Archive in Marbach or to the National Library of Israel. The case was finally decided in favour of the Israeli Library in 2016, with the manuscripts handed over in 2019. This legal battle over the physical manuscripts adds another layer to the question of who controls Kafka's legacy. The work has been published and translated and is now in the public domain in most jurisdictions. But the original manuscripts with Kafka's handwriting and corrections and insertions have their own value and significance. The fight over them shows how Kafka's work continues to generate conflict and contested claims even a century after his death. The instruction to burn was Kafka's last attempt to control his image and his work. It failed, or perhaps succeeded in a paradoxical way that only Kafka could have appreciated. The work was preserved precisely because the instruction tried to prevent preservation. The friend who loved him best betrayed him by ignoring his wishes. The manuscripts he wanted destroyed became sacred texts. The privacy he craved was abolished, and the name he would have preferred to forget entered the language as an adjective used by people who have never read a word he wrote. From this fraught posthumous fate emerged Kafka's transformation into cultural icon and the word that bears his name's most widespread legacy, Kafkaesque. The immediate years after Kafka's death in 1924 saw Max Brod working intensively on his friend's literary estate. The trial was published in 1925, assembled from Kafka's manuscript chapters, with Brod making editorial decisions about order and inclusion. The Castle followed in 1926. America, the earliest and least finished of the three novels, was published in 1927. These editions presented Kafka to a wider audience than had known him during his lifetime. The small literary circles in Prague and Berlin that had recognized his genius were now joined by readers across the German-speaking world and eventually beyond. Critics began to respond. Some were enthusiastic, others were baffled. The work was clearly extraordinary, but what exactly it was doing remained difficult to articulate. Brod also published a biography of Kafka in 1937. The biography presented Kafka as a saint-like figure, tortured by his genius and his sensitivity, too good and pure for the world he inhabited. Brod emphasized Kafka's gentleness, his scrupulous honesty, his struggle with his father and with women. He presented the work as stemming from this biographical struggle, as Kafka's attempt to capture his inner experience in fiction. This biographical approach shaped Kafka interpretation for decades. Readers learned to see the father wound in the fiction, to read the trial as autobiography, to understand the metamorphosis as Kafka's sense of being a burden to his family. The approach had truth but also limitations. It sometimes reduced the fiction to symptom of neurosis, as if the works were interesting primarily as documents of Kafka's psychology, rather than as literary and philosophical achievements in their own right. The first English translations appeared in the 1930s. Willer and Edwin Muir translated The Castle in 1930, The Trial in 1935, and America in 1938. Their translations shaped how English-speaking readers encountered Kafka. The Muir's prose was formal and somewhat archaic, which gave the work a timeless quality, but perhaps lost some of Kafka's own stylistic precision and dark humour. These English translations brought Kafka to the attention of writers and intellectuals in Britain and America. W. H. Auden wrote about Kafka, recognizing his religious and existential dimensions. Edmund Wilson and other critics engaged with the work, but Kafka remained a specialized taste, read by literary and intellectual circles, but not widely known to general readers. Then came World War II and the Holocaust. The world Kafka had known was destroyed. Prague's German-speaking Jewish community was annihilated. Kafka's three sisters were murdered in concentration camps along with millions of others. The Central European culture that had produced Kafka was erased. His fiction began to be read not just as psychological document or philosophical allegory, but as prophecy, as vision of the totalitarian nightmare that had engulfed Europe. Kafka had not written about totalitarianism as such. He died in 1924, before Stalin's Great Purges and before Hitler came to power. His courts and castles and incomprehensible bureaucracies were not representations of specific political systems. But readers after 1945 could not help seeing in Kafka's work a vision of arbitrary authority, of individuals crushed by systems they could not understand or resist, of guilt assigned without crime and judgment rendered without appeal. This reading made Kafka relevant to the historical moment. The trial seemed to describe Stalin's show trials, where the accused confessed to crimes they had not committed. The castle seemed to describe any totalitarian bureaucracy where citizens seek recognition and permission from authorities who remained forever inaccessible. The Metamorphosis seemed to describe what totalitarian systems do to individuals, transforming them into something their communities can no longer recognize or accept. The totalitarian interpretation was not entirely wrong, but it was reductive. Kafka's work is more universal and more strange than any political reading can capture. Yet this reading helped make Kafka famous beyond literary circles. He became the prophet who had somehow seen the 20th century before it fully emerged, the writer who had articulated the logic of totalitarianism before totalitarianism existed in its full form. Meanwhile, Max Brod continued his work as Kafka's advocate and interpreter. He lectured about Kafka. He wrote articles. He responded to critics and scholars. He controlled the manuscripts and negotiated with publishers. He shaped Kafka's image, sometimes in ways that later scholars would dispute, but always with genuine devotion to his friend's memory and genius. Brod fled Prague in March 1939, just ahead of the Nazi occupation. He took Kafka's manuscripts with him in a suitcase, one of the most important pieces of luggage in literary history. He settled in Tel Aviv and lived there until his death in 1968. He continued working on Kafka's legacy, producing new editions and translations, writing about him, giving interviews. He never wavered in his belief that preserving Kafka's work had been the right decision. The manuscripts and letters Brod preserved became the basis for scholarly editions that attempted to present Kafka's texts with greater accuracy than Brod's editions had achieved. The critical edition of Kafka's works, published over decades beginning in the 1980s, examined the manuscripts carefully, showing Kafka's revisions and variants, presenting fragmentary works in their fragmentary state rather than imposing artificial order. These scholarly editions complicated the received image of Kafka. They showed his work was more unfinished, more in process, more uncertain than Brod's editions had suggested. They revealed a writer who constantly revised and who left much abandoned midstream. They made visible Kafka's actual creative process rather than just his polished results. The scholarly work also revealed the extent to which Brod had shaped what readers thought of as Kafka's work. Brod had made editorial choices that were sometimes justified but sometimes arbitrary. He had ordered chapters in The Trial and the Castle according to his judgment rather than based on clear authorial intention. He had smoothed some prose and removed some material. The scholar's Kafka was messier and more uncertain than Brod's Kafka, but perhaps closer to what Kafka himself had actually produced. Max Brod's legacy is thus double-edged. He saved Kafka's work from destruction and devoted his life to promoting it. But he also shaped that work in ways that sometimes obscured what Kafka actually wrote. He gave the world Kafka, but gave us a Kafka partly of his own construction. This is perhaps inevitable when an editor becomes the gatekeeper and interpreter of a major writer's posthumous work. Without Brod, there would be no Kafka as we know him. With Brod, we have Kafka, but filtered through Brod's understanding and decisions. The friendship that produced Kafka's survival also complicated his legacy. This paradox would have appealed to Kafka, who understood better than almost anyone how help and hindrance, salvation and obstacle, gift and burden can be the same thing viewed from different angles. What cannot be disputed is that Brod's refusal to burn the manuscripts gave the world one of the essential writers of modern literature. The ethical problems that Refusal created are real but abstract. The works themselves are concrete and invaluable. And from those works emerged not just literary influence, but a word that entered the common language to name a particular quality of experience that people everywhere recognize, even when they have never read the stories that inspired it. Kafkaesque entered English and other languages to name something people recognized but had struggled to describe. Situations where you are trapped in illogical systems, subject to arbitrary authority, unable to navigate procedures that should be straightforward but that become impossibly complex. The word describes the experience of dealing with bureaucracies that seem designed to frustrate, with regulations that contradict themselves, with authorities that render judgments they will not explain. The word is often misused. People call frustrating situations Kafkaesque when they are merely annoying or inconvenient. Being stuck in traffic is not Kafkaesque. Having to fill out a long form is not Kafkaesque. Dealing with an inefficient customer service department is usually just boring and irritating, not Kafkaesque. A situation is genuinely Kafkaesque when the procedures are nightmarishly complex, when the rules seem deliberately obscure, when authority is simultaneously present and inaccessible, when you are accused of something you did not do or did not know was forbidden, when your attempts to clarify things make them worse, when every solution creates new problems, when the system seems designed to prevent resolution while insisting it exists to help you. A genuinely Kafkaesque situation involves several elements. First, there is an authority or system with real power over your life. Second, this authority operates by rules you cannot discern or understand. Third, your attempts to engage with the authority fail because you cannot reach anyone with actual decision-making power, or because the procedures loop endlessly without progress. Fourth, despite the system's opacity and irrationality, it functions and makes judgments that affect you. Fifth, there is a nightmarish quality where the logic seems dreamlike and the situation combines precision and absurdity. Legal and immigration systems generate many Kafkaesque situations. People find themselves trapped in contradictory requirements. You need a visa to work, but cannot get a visa without a job offer. You need a job offer, but employers will not hire you without a visa. You are told you must appear for an appointment, but the appointment system provides no available dates. Your application is denied, but you cannot learn why or how to appeal. Medical and insurance bureaucracies create Kafkaesque situations when treatment is denied for reasons that make no sense, when you are caught between insurance companies and healthcare providers, each claiming the other is responsible, when you follow all procedures but still cannot get care approved, when the people you speak with cannot help you and cannot connect you to people who can. Academic and professional licensing systems can be Kafkaesque when requirements change retroactively, when you complete all stated requirements but then learn of additional unstated requirements, when the people reviewing your case interpret rules differently than the people who initially advised you, when appealing one decision triggers new problems you could not have anticipated. The Kafkaesque appears wherever systems that claim to serve people actually trap them, wherever rules meant to clarify become obstacles, wherever authority insists on its legitimacy while operating in ways that seem arbitrary or malicious. The word names a common experience of modern life in bureaucratic societies where much depends on navigating institutional procedures, yet those procedures often seem designed to be illegible. but the word also carries connotations beyond mere institutional frustration. To call something Kafkaesque implies a metaphysical dimension, a sense that the situation reveals something deeper about existence itself. It suggests that this is not merely a badly designed system, but something that exposes the fundamental arbitrariness of authority, the gap between appearance and reality, the impossibility of reaching the truth or justice or resolution that systems claim to provide. This metaphysical dimension is what distinguishes genuinely Kafkaesque situations from mere inconvenience. When you are in a truly Kafkaesque situation, you start to doubt your own sanity and judgment. You wonder if everyone else understands rules you cannot grasp. You feel simultaneously guilty and innocent, certain you have done nothing wrong, yet unable to escape the sense that somehow you are at fault. You experience yourself as both inside and outside the system, subject to its judgments, yet unable to participate in its logic. The spread of Kafka's name into common usage represents a curious kind of triumph and defeat both. The word Kafkaesque has become so widely used that most people who use it have never read Kafka. They know the adjective without knowing the works that inspired it. Kafka becomes a brand or reference point rather than an author to be read. Yet the word's ubiquity also confirms Kafka's insight. He articulated something permanent about modern life in bureaucratic societies. The experience he captured in fiction a century ago remains immediately recognizable. People do not need to read the trial to know what it means to be caught in procedures that make no sense, to seek authorities who cannot be reached, to be judged by standards that are never specified. The word has also been extended to art and culture. Kafkaesque films, plays, and novels are those that capture something of Kafka's vision, the impossible made precise, the bureaucratic made nightmarish, the ordinary invaded by the inexplicable. Directors like David Lynch, filmmakers like Terry Gilliam, writers like Paul Auster and Haruki Murakami have produced works called Kafkaesque, though Kafka's influence on them varies. The word appears in political discourse, sometimes usefully and sometimes as mere rhetoric. Totalitarian systems are called Kafkaesque, though as noted earlier, Kafka was not writing about totalitarianism specifically. Oppressive legal systems are called Kafkaesque when they combine official legitimacy with arbitrary application. Any situation where authority operates incomprehensibly gets labelled Kafkaesque, sometimes accurately and often not. The reduction of Kafka to an adjective is both tribute and diminishment. It confirms his insight was profound enough to name a category of human experience, but it also abstracts that insight from the literary achievements that gave it form. The Kafkaesque exists independent of Kafka now, a concept people can grasp without ever reading the stories and novels where Kafka actually worked out his vision with such precision. Perhaps this is the final paradox of Kafka's legacy. He wanted his work destroyed, but it was preserved. He wrote for a small audience, but became world famous. He created fiction of extreme specificity that has been universalized into a common adjective. He sought privacy and got perpetual exposure. He tried to escape the judgment of posterity, but that judgment has been overwhelmingly favourable. Everything turned out opposite to what he intended or hoped, which is a very Kafkaesque fate for the man who invented the Kafkaesque. But beyond the adjective and beyond the cultural appropriations, there remain the actual works and the question of why they still matter when read carefully rather than reduced to concepts or references. This is what we must finally address. What it means to read Kafka today and why his vision remains essential. 100 years after Franz Kafka's death, his work remains essential for reasons that go beyond historical importance or literary influence. The Trial is not merely a modernist classic or a document of early 20th century anxiety. It is a precise map of how authority operates when stripped of justifying narratives. The castle is not only an allegory of seeking God or reaching bureaucratic centres. It is an exact description of how systems mediate and defer and prevent arrival. The Metamorphosis is not just a story about alienation or family dysfunction. It is transformation presented as fact that must be endured though not understood. Kafka matters because he saw clearly something that most writing tries to obscure or deny. That much of existence is incomprehensible, though perfectly real, that we are subject to powers we cannot reach, though they reach us effortlessly, that guilt precedes crime and judgment, precedes understanding, that we wake into situations we did not choose and find ourselves already transformed into what we cannot accept. He matters because he refused to explain away the strangeness. His characters do not receive the revelation that makes everything clear. Joseph K. does not learn why he was arrested. K. does not reach the castle. The man from the country does not enter the law. Gregor Samsa does not understand why he transformed. Kafka gives us situations without solutions, questions without answers, conditions without exits. And somehow this refusal to provide resolution feels more honest than the false comfort of explanation. He matters because his technical achievement matches his vision. Kafka's prose is precise without being mechanical, simple without being simplistic, clear without being reductive. He describes impossible events with the same neutral exactness he uses for ordinary ones. The result is prose that makes the fantastic feel inevitable and the ordinary feel strange. Few writers have matched this combination of clarity and weirdness, precision and impossibility. He matters because the structures he perceived remain active. Contemporary readers do not need footnotes to understand the trial. They recognize immediately the experience of dealing with systems that judge them by standards they cannot discern, that require procedures they cannot complete, that involve authorities they cannot reach. The specific forms change, but the pattern persists. He matters because he understood guilt as ontological condition rather than psychological state. We are guilty not for what we have done, but for being what we are, inadequate before demands we cannot meet, insufficient for roles we cannot escape, complicit in systems we did not create but benefit from or participate in despite ourselves. This insight becomes more rather than less relevant as historical distance increases. He matters because he shows how authority operates through inaccessibility rather than through overt force. The court in the trial never uses violence against Joseph K. until the execution. It simply makes him unable to live normally by creating uncertainty and dread. The castle in the castle never refuses K directly. It simply defers and mediates and prevents arrival. Modern power often works this way, not through dramatic confrontation, but through procedure and postponement, and the exhaustion of those seeking recognition or justice or change. He matters because his humour is essential rather than incidental. The Metamorphosis is tragic, but also darkly funny. The trial includes absurd moments that would be comic if they were not so horrible. A hunger artist combines pathos and irony in ways that prevent simple emotional response. Kafka's work is not grim in any simple sense. It finds the comic in horror and the horrible in comedy, showing how close these qualities are to each other. He matters because he articulated what it means to be conscious in a body that will fail. The hunger artist who cannot find food he likes, the vermin who remains partly human in consciousness, the prisoner with the sentence inscribed in his flesh, the tubercular writer starving because his throat will not swallow. These are not metaphors but literal descriptions of embodied existence as contradiction and suffering without redemption. He matters because later writers learned from him and extended his vision. Borges's infinite libraries and labyrinthine catalogues, Beckett's waiting and repetition and failing, Camus' absurd heroes continuing despite meaninglessness, Coetze's examinations of power and complicity, Marquez's magical realism that treats marvels as ordinary, all of these bear Kafka's mark. He created technical and thematic possibilities that literature continues to explore. He matters because reading him is not comfortable or consoling, but necessary. His work does not make us feel better about existence. It makes us see existence more clearly, which is more valuable than comfort. It strips away the narratives we use to justify systems and reveals how those systems actually function. It shows us our own guilt and inadequacy without offering absolution. This is not pleasant, but it is illuminating. He matters because his personal struggles, while specific to his circumstances, illuminate permanent aspects of being human. The father who cannot be satisfied represents all authority that judges without explaining. The engagements that cannot be sustained represent all attempts to reconcile incompatible needs. The body that fails represents all embodiment's eventual betrayal. The work that cannot be finished represents all seeking that defines us though we never arrive. He matters because he did not preach or prescribe, but simply showed. His fiction does not tell us what to think or how to live. It presents situations and follows their logic with remorseless accuracy. The reader must decide what these situations mean and how to respond. This restraint respects the reader's intelligence while refusing to provide false comfort. He matters because the conflicts he could not resolve in life, he transformed into literature that does not resolve them but makes them visible. The letter to his father that was never sent became part of his literary legacy. The instruction to burn that was ignored preserved what we read. The relationships that failed gave him material he used with complete honesty about failure. The tuberculosis that killed him shaped stories about bodies and hunger and inscription that remain unsurpassed. He matters because his vision is complete without being closed. You can read Kafka through religious frameworks, or existential frameworks, or political frameworks, or psychoanalytic frameworks, and find support for each reading in the work itself. The texts accommodate interpretation without being exhausted by any interpretation. They remain open, resistant to final explanations, capable of meaning differently to different readers and different historical moments. He matters because he makes us see the gap between who we are and who we claim to be, between the systems we endorse and how those systems actually operate, between our conscious intentions and our actual effects. This seeing is uncomfortable, but essential for anyone trying to think clearly about existence, society, authority, guilt, and the possibility or impossibility of justice. Most fundamentally, Kafka matters because consciousness wakes to find itself already transformed, already accused, already seeking what cannot be reached. This was true when Kafka wrote it in Prague a century ago. It remains true now. The specific forms of transformation and accusation and seeking change across time and place. The structure remains constant. Kafka found words for what should be unsayable. Those words still name what we experience but struggle to articulate. One morning we wake from troubled dreams and discover that everything has already changed. We do not know when the change occurred or why. We only know that we must continue, must try to explain ourselves, though no one is listening, must seek authorities though they cannot be reached, must live as if life made sense though the sense escapes us. This is the condition Kafka mapped with unbearable precision. This is why his work remains essential rather than merely important, alive rather than merely canonical, necessary rather than merely respected. Kafka saw what most of us avert our eyes from. He did not offer solutions because there are none. He offered vision, and vision, however dark, is more valuable than blindness, however comfortable. We read Kafka not to feel better, but to see more clearly. And seeing clearly even when what we see as our own impossibility is the beginning of whatever truth remains available to us.